evening. The planning board meeting on Tuesday, November 7th will come to order. I know most of you are here for one of the public hearings, but if you could bear with us a few minutes, we have a few pieces of business with that we just have to attend to first, and then we will get to the public hearing. First item is on the master plan. Jean?
So tonight, big night, because we have updates from three components of the master plan. So the master plan itself, Eric Havelson is here from RKG Associates, who is our consultant. We have Angela Vincent here from Merrimack Valley Planning Commission to give an update on the regional housing plan. And we are expecting Judy Barrett from Barrett Planning Group to come and talk about the zoning diagnostic.
Okay, good. So let's go in order. Yeah. All yours.
How you doing? Judy is on her way. Traffic was a little heavier, I think, than...
Yeah, maybe stand back. No way we never have a problem.
So you each have, what I'm displaying is the project schedule, so you should each have a hard copy of that as well in your packet.
Okay, go ahead.
Great. Tommy, I am expecting her to be here to do an update on the zoning diagnostic. But open to any questions you have. I thought I would just give a quick overview on the master plan side of things as to where we are now. Over the last couple months, I think since I met with all of you maybe 2 months ago or so, we finished up the existing conditions report. Thank you to everybody on the planning board who submitted comments. We received between the planning board staff and the committee about over 400 individual comments on that. So I think we've got a pretty good document, and that's now up on the town's master plan website. And we encourage you all, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, members of the public who might be here in the room or listening tonight, to take a look at it. I believe Jean and Eric are setting up a master plan specific email that people can use. I think you mentioned that.
Yep, so the website has been updated where comments can be entered from the public and come to our website. There's been a lot of other enhancements to the website, so if you haven't looked at it, take a look. There's a lot of, it's very easy now to get to the information. So.
Yeah, so if anybody has any comments, please submit them through the email on the website. There are a handful of comments that we're still working on. We just needed a little bit more time to do some research. We had a pretty quick turnaround to get that document up on the website about a week before the public meeting that we held last week, just to give folks a chance to read that. But you know, if you submitted comments and you didn't see that they were specifically addressed, there are a handful of them that we're still working on. The other big update was last week we had the first public meeting for the master plan. Definitely blew my attendance away. I thought maybe we'd have 100 or 150. I think we had at least close to 200, somewhere around 200 people. It was an awesome meeting. Had a lot of great feedback from people who attended. We just as an overview, we had a brief presentation in the very beginning, and then most of the time we spent people walked around to different stations that were organized throughout the different 7 master plan topics. We had maps and boards and information. Consultant staff and members of the master plan committee were at each of the stations to talk to people and get their feedback. And then they talked to us, and they also left post-it notes with their thoughts, so that we're right now in the process of just compiling all those. Then we're going to use all the feedback that we received from that last public meeting to begin to craft a vision statement for the master plan, and then goals for each of the individual chapters. So that's really the next big piece of the plan that we're going to be working on over this month and probably into the earlier part of December.
So if I could just add one thing to that. So the committee has scheduled a meeting tomorrow night at the Stevens Estate at 7 to attract anybody that maybe couldn't make it to the meeting or didn't feel as though they had enough time to voice all their concerns. So it's a Stevens Estate at 7. 4 of the topics are going to be covered there. The agenda is posted. And then a week from tomorrow, which is Thursday the 16th, there's a second follow-up meeting to cover the other 3 components of the master plan. So it's 2 sessions. Everybody's welcome. Same type of format will be held at the Stevens Estate.
Any questions from the board or comments?
I went to the the forum the other day. I agree, it was very well attended. One question I had, which I found it interesting that there was a dichotomy of comments. Some were like extremely specific, so including my wife told me to write something extremely specific about a crosswalk in a certain location, or lack thereof, and some were extremely broad about housing, just traffic. How do you try to kind of go with those two juxtapositions of the specific and the general and meld that into what you will ultimately present?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the more broad topic-based comments that we've received and things we're thinking about, I find most useful when we're thinking about goals, because those tend to be much broader. And then when we look at actual specific implementation recommendations, which would be the third phase of the master plan, kind of in the spring, then we would look to those comments where somebody might say, oh, this intersection along Route 114, or this roadway in my neighborhood could really use sidewalks, and we'll start to compile all those similar types of specific comments together, and then present those as part of an implementation piece in the master plan. So it's great to hear kind of broad brush stuff and then specifics.
The other comments from the board? Pete?
I think there may be some members of the master plan committee here. Is there anyone from the master plan committee? So
Tom Zarico and John Waters.
I just wanted to thank the members of the master plan committee for really devoting what was obviously a tremendous amount of effort and enthusiasm for the master plan process. That's a real commitment of time and energy, and I think it showed with the remarkable turnout at the high school. So thank you very much to the members of the master plan committee. It was really terrific. Well done.
Good. And I don't know if any of you had any comments just about how you thought it went and maybe what you learned from it very quickly.
Okay, so
Good.
you still with that? So
Right.
Angela Vincent is here for the regional housing plan update.
Yes.
Good.
Hello, good to see you again. So since the last time we saw you, so it must have been early summer, we've been very busy. We completed 13 community workshops, so similar to the one that we conducted here at the Senior Center in June. We went to 11 other communities, to 12 other communities, and conducted those, collecting hundreds of comments about the needs in the Valley, specifically in each community, but also region-wide, around senior housing, around starter homes, around renovating older homes, about looking at disabilities. And so those comments then had us collect about 46 additional data sets for each community, which is compiled into a full-blown needs assessment with a variety of different types of information, including who's living in North Andover, where they're living right now, and what they're making, and what the gap of income is between what they can afford and what the median sales price is for the homes here now. So that information will be presented next week, I believe, on Tuesday.
Wednesday night.
Wednesday, apologies, on the 15th at 7 p.m. at the Senior Center. So there will be a little bit of an overlap of the housing work, but we did collect some different, and actually we've worked very closely on the information that's presented in the housing chapter, the element versus the housing production plan or the housing plan for North Andover. And there is actually some interesting and different data sources. So, but we still will be managing the final strategies and making sure they are overlapping and not conflicting in any way. So again, RKG and ourselves will be working very closely with that. We're still looking forward to having comments on Co-Urbanize, which is our virtual tool that we're using to engage the public who may not be able to come to a public meeting or in between the meetings or workshops, as we're calling them. And that is courb.co/MV housing. And we've actually switched gears because we're not focusing on needs anymore and more so on strategies, which we'll be talking about next week. And we're asking a variety of different issues around how to, accommodate for millennials and younger people either coming to and or wanting to stay in the Valley, accommodating for senior housing and accessible housing, and rehabilitation of our existing homes. So you can see lots of new questions and new ways to interact with that tool online.
Is that linked to the town site?
I believe it was the last regional, community workshop. Hopefully it will be again.
I'll check it.
Is there anything either of you need from us or questions of us or help that we can provide to make the process easier?
I would say for us, it would be great to have you at the meeting because we're hoping, or at the workshop, because we're hoping that when we come back, then the next step will be approval by the planning board first, and then the Board of Selectmen, so that it can then go on to the Department of Housing and Community Development to become a certifiable housing production plan. And so coming to those workshops is important so you can hear what's coming out of those and final strategies, so they're not, plopped on you last minute to review, although we will provide a document in advance so that it's not going to be, coming off the cuff. You'll be able to see things in advance, but hearing what your fellow townspeople are saying and other board members, we had ZBA members at the last meeting, Affordable Housing Committee folks. It was actually very well attended, I thought, at the last Housing Committee meetings, Housing Workshop.
Remember when this started, I reached out to all the boards and asked them to just name a representative, and so the ZBA had two, the Stu Board of Selectmen, Council on Aging, the CPC. So it was, I think we had near 20 people, which for this type of meeting was a really good attendance, and they were really stakeholders that had very specific interest across a variety of topics.
But that's a great question. We'd love to have you more engaged in any way, if there's either through the virtual tool or if you have questions on the specific data. Everything that is presented, I should add, is put up on our website after the workshops. So on the Get Involved page under our programs for this project, all the presentations, including the last one, and then next week's on Wednesday will be uploaded on Thursday.
Great. Okay, good. Thank you so much.
Okay, in the nick of time. So Judy Barrett is here from Barrett Planning Group, and she will speak about the zoning component of the master plan.
Quite proud out there.
Yes.
They're very interested in the master plan.
Yes, very interested.
We've been waiting for you.
Yes.
That was the sense I had when I You're all here because we're here to talk about zoning tonight. Anyway, I apologize for being late. So I wanted to give you kind of an update on where we are with reviewing your zoning bylaw, and maybe even get a little bit of direction from the board tonight, if that's all right with you. I spoke with Eric last week during the meeting, the public meeting, about trying to get a sense from the town about how far do you want to scope an update of your zoning bylaw, because I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you, but there's some big issues that have to be addressed, and I don't know how far you want to go with this, so let me try to lay out for you kind of a couple of scenarios. If nothing else, the bylaw needs kind of a soup to nuts update. There are a lot of definitions that are kind of out of date. There are some terms that aren't defined. So things like that kind of need to be done. There are things that we could do to probably make this an easier document for everybody to work with. You have sections in here where you have pretty prescriptive lists of sufficient requirements and procedures for the board. You don't really need to put that in your zoning. If you pull those things out and just put them into your rules and regulations, number one, it makes it easier for you to modify your administrative procedures if you need to do that, because now you don't have to go to town meeting and ask for a 2/3 vote to change something like, how many copies of an application does someone have to submit? But it also just takes some of the bulk out of the document. I mean, I think one of the things, again, I'm coming in from the outside, right? So one of the things that's really interesting about your zoning is that I have to go through all of this just to even get to the first page, because there's so much stuff up front. Now, that information may be very useful to you, but that's the sort of thing that you might want to either park in the back, or maybe you have as a reference guide in the planning department. So that's just that kind of thing we could do without really sort of disturbing policy. If you want to go to the level of policy, then I think we've got layers of an onion that need to be kind of pulled back, because I think one of the impressions I have of the bylaw, and to some extent it was kind of reinforced in the interviews that I did in August, I think the town has tried to work with applicants. That's sort of the way this bylaw reads to me, that instead of just being very rigid, you've tried to work with applicants who came in with perhaps good ideas. But what's happened is that the bylaw has mushroomed. It's a big document now, so a lot of overlays. I actually don't think I've ever worked in a town that has as many overlay districts as you do. And, you can say, well, that's because you have these sort of unique locations that don't really lend themselves to the district that's there, but we don't really want to change the whole district. Or you kind of look at it as, over time, I think this has become a very fragmented bylaw. And it's not, I don't say this as criticism of you as a town. I just think it's what happens when your community is sort of at a certain point in build out and you have properties that probably need another look or maybe need some kind of different investment than what the zoning says. And so rather than go through a whole lot of long planning process, someone has a good idea and you kind of jump on it. And that's kind of how these overlays sort of proliferate over time, is that a bunch of good ideas come in and you want to work with somebody, so you do. But I think really when you then step back and just look at the map, it's a very fragmented, it's a map that's asking for fragmented development. And I'm not sure that's really what you want. Now, there might be other ways to phrase that, but that's what I see. So I don't know how far the board wants to go in terms of kind of peeling back the layers of the onion versus getting a document that's easier to work with, that's internally consistent. There's a lot of little things like, aside from definitions that need to be updated, you have some inconsistent terminology in here. Sometimes, as bylaws are amended incrementally over time, there's sort of a new way to say something, and so the new way kicks in, but then the old way is still somewhere else. And so these little inconsistencies in terminology begin to surface. We can easily kind of clean those things up. But I think when it gets to kind of big land use policy questions, it's a much more complicated project, and I don't know what the town's appetite is for going that far. So I need some direction from you. I'm not afraid to put all those recommendations out there, but I don't know how far you want to go with this sort of zoning update.
I don't know what folks think.
What is the scope of your, I guess I'm curious in terms of what you're authorized to do in terms of your pay and what it'll cost, and those, I think those things are important, at least.
Well, they are important. I mean, I think within the scope of what we have right now, we can clean this thing up. I think we can get it a more navigable, easy to work with document. I think there are some policy tweaks that could be made without a big disturbance of the whole content. But when it comes to really sort of pulling apart these overlay districts, or even, that's not really the issue. The issue is the base zoning. I mean, why do communities have a whole proliferation of overlay districts? Is because the base zoning isn't working. So, to start really going down that path, I think it's almost like a post-master plan. Once you sort of know what your land use goals are, then I think you're in a much better position to have that conversation. But right now, I wouldn't know what to do.
So, I mean, it's interesting to me because generally what I see is that there's an area of need. Okay, you have an area by, let's just say, by a river. We need to rezone that because we want to do something more commercial in the back. So you take one area, figure out what you need, and you zone it.
Yeah.
And then the people in that area are affected. They can, perfect their rights in terms of grandfathering, in terms of subdivision, all of that stuff. The idea of kind of overhauling the whole zoning and making it a more modern document is appealing. I worry about the practical implications of that if you have the whole town trying to figure out what are my rights, what are my new rights going to be, that kind of stuff.
Well, I don't know if you even want to try to do that when you're in the middle of a master plan process where you're making those decisions.
Yes, I agree. I think those go hand in hand. It just seems it doesn't seem that worthwhile to me if that is going to be the ultimate goal of doing housekeeping changes. Too many housekeeping changes if you're going to just throw the whole thing out and start over again.
Well, that's another question too. I think this document needs, if you didn't disturb any policy, you just kept all the policies you've got, I think this bylaw really needs to be reorganized. It's a very daunting book to get through, and you guys may love it because you're used to it.
No, I don't.
But I always try to look at these things from the perspective of kind of Joe resident who's just trying to figure out, or Jane resident, what he or she can do with their property, and it's really hard. You have this whole section of of the sort of district use regulations kind of laid out in an outline format, which is not done anywhere anymore because it just lends itself to a lot of inconsistency. What you really need, in my opinion, is a good, usable table of uses in here. You know what that does, among other things? It gets rid of inconsistent use of words. When you have an outline structure like what you have now, as you provide for a use in districts A, D, and G, the words change a little bit. And so all of a sudden, what is intended by a term becomes less clear. But when you have a table of uses and all the districts laid out in the table, you're only showing that word once. You're showing the term once. And what the table does is tell you, well, where can this be done or where not. So even that just gets rid of a lot of inconsistency. The language becomes more uniform. Those are the kinds of things we could do now, within the context of this update.
Sounds very worth it.
Go ahead, Pete.
So I like the idea of, I think you've laid out two options. One is the administrative housekeeping, straighten out the document, and then the other is peel back the onion with policy. And on the former, the housekeeping, the cleanup, the administrative, I'm all for it. As you gave us constructive examples of the result of a document that has accreted over time, I recognize the things you were observing because I saw them, and sort of asked myself and figured, well, I guess I'm not smart enough to understand why it's like this. But you have answered it's like this because it's the result of, well-intended accretion over time.
Yeah.
So I would love to see the administrative cleanups. I think I would agree with what I think Etan said, that I'm also very intrigued with the onion and the policy look. And maybe another way of framing how it relates to the master plan is maybe no better time than after you go through a master planning effort to take on what I think would be daunting with peeling back the onion. The thing I worry about there is unintended consequences, where out of a well-intended effort to peel back the onion and address the policy, you end up with something that you didn't expect to happen. So that would be a big concern for me.
I mean, I think that we can maybe try to help identify some potential risk areas for that. Your point is so well taken, though. I think that since this is happening concurrent with the master plan update, I don't think we have the space in this project to peel back the layers of the onion, but I think we can help walk you through sort of how to go about that. Hopefully what the master plan does is start to lay out what those layers, how many layers there are, what they look like, and perhaps what the land use policy direction should be, so that then you'll have, coming out of this, a cleaned up, easier to work with document that will also be easier to amend. I mean, there's little things in here like you number your terms in the definition section. So when you want to add something, you can't help but get the list eventually out of alphabetical order. Well, you don't need to number the definitions. You just need a page format that makes it clear. Here's a term, here's a definition. You can slip things in if you need to and retain the alphabetical order of the list. But it's fallen out of that because of the numbering system. It's little things like that.
So I think fair enough that the administrative cleanup we definitely think is useful. I think when the policy issue, to some degree, you have to go down pretty far down the path of the master plan to see if we're going to actually change some of our policy purposes or not. And that's, if you look at the major changes in the zoning, certainly since the long period that I've been involved in it, it's come out in policy issues. All the watershed zoning really is policy issues. So we ought to partway go down the path and then decide what we want to do, but have that inform us, I think. Any other comments from the board?
I mean, for whatever it's worth, I had to look at the zoning and
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me, again, I know you have a meter clicking, but it almost feels to me it'd be nice to have actually a little bit more hands-on workshop sometime with us to actually go through some of this.
I actually would like to do that. I had another suggestion, and I don't know how this will go over, but I'm just going to say it. In a couple of other communities I've worked in on like a big zoning project, I've actually, instead of working just with the planning board, I've had an all boards meeting because
other boards, other land use boards, conservation, board of health, other selectmen, other people are affected by what's in here and how, frankly, how it's administered and how it's interpreted. And sometimes you end up with inconsistencies between rules and regulations or inconsistencies in the policy framework of one board to the next. So having an all boards meeting is actually, from a zoning consultant's point of view, a really helpful way to get at what's going on here. It's just a suggestion.
Yeah, okay. Gene, maybe we can see if we can put that together. What do people think?
Yeah.
No, I think it's a great idea.
You'll learn a lot.
Yeah, I can imagine. More than we want to, maybe.
Yeah.
So, great. Well, we've got a lot on our agenda tonight. I normally like to go longer, but we have a lot of people waiting on the topic. They were not here for this, Judy. Believe it or not, they were not here for the zoning. So, thank you, but we appreciate it, and, let's maybe see if we can set that up. I think that'd be a great idea.
No, I would love to.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Thank you.
And the same, one last question, same question we have to everybody else is, do you have any request of us beyond what you've already mentioned at this point? Things you need from us? Okay.
No, I just need to get this done.
Okay. What we'd like to do now is, if you can just beg our indulgence very quickly, we had a topic with a couple members of the Board of Health that we've invited to come talk. I'd like to have that discussion very quickly, and then we'll move into the public hearing. So, go ahead.
So at your request, we invited a couple members of the Board of Health, and two have graciously appeared tonight. We have Larry Fixler and Dr. Frank McMillan. And so you asked for comment related to the public health elements of recreational marijuana. They recently had this item on their agenda. Peter did attend that meeting as well, so Peter might have some
Peter,
input.
maybe you can tee up the...
So at our last board meeting, we talked about gathering input, and one area was to get a perspective on public health related to recreational marijuana. So I did attend a Board of Health meeting. They had what I thought was a very rich discussion and gave me the opportunity to describe what I thought the planning board was looking for, which was for input from people with more expertise in public health than we have. And in addition to being willing to come and speak about those perspectives, the Board of Health also found a report from Colorado. I'll let the members speak to that, but just to note that the summary of the report is in our packet. It's about 30 pages in.
I think you have a hard copy tonight as well.
Yes, it's got a color cover page. And thank you very much for being willing to come and offer a perspective on this.
Thank you very much. I'm Larry Fixler from the Board of Health. Thank you for having us here, Mr. Chairman. Basically, again, Colorado, when they became a retail state, the state health department mandated that they set up a commission for every 2 years to examine what the effect of using retail selling of marijuana has done to the residents, from adolescents to adults, from hospitalizations to automotive type accidents. We're not here to give a presentation on that report. I used that as some frame of reference when we had our Board of Health meeting, when Peter was here with us. It was more that you were going to ask us questions on the public health dynamics of selling or using marijuana. So I'll just say, if you look at marijuana, it can be smoked, it can be vaporized and inhaled, it can be consumed in any form of a candy or anything else, but basically it's a drug, and it's tetrahydrocannabinol is the active component of marijuana, THC. So anytime you're asking what a public health issue has to do with something like marijuana, you're introducing and legalizing and making it easier for a product that it may be a plant, but it has drug-like effects, to now come into being able to purchase retail. So people that used marijuana prior, whether it be for medicinal purposes or obtained it illegally for recreational use, will now probably use marijuana and purchase it in the retail setting. People that had never used it may, now that it is legal and will eventually be set up, may decide to try it because it's legal and they heard a lot about it. So these are the public health issues that one would look at if you're introducing a drug-type product into the marketplace that is now legal. The same as tobacco, cigarettes. When they smoke marijuana has, from what I understand, 4 times the amount of tar produced from the American Lung Association than a cigarette. So there are ramifications when the legalization occurs. Alcohol. So if you look at marijuana now, marijuana's been introduced now in the same type of category as opening up a liquor store, selling tobacco, any other type of vice. And all 3 have drug-like effects to the body and many type side effects.
One of the things that we try to do, excuse me, is our board did not take a position on this because it's a political question. But if you do decide to move forward with that sort of thing, there are some things that you should take into consideration. One is that according to the Colorado study, about 6% of women who are pregnant will tend to use marijuana. That's a target population that you probably want to reach out to. The other thing that came out of this, and also from a different study, basically the Surgeon General's report on addiction, is that you really want to target younger people, generally under the age of 14, because those are the people who are much more likely to develop a substance use disorder if they're exposed to any mind-altering substance at an early age, whether it's tobacco, alcohol, or cannabis. So you're going to have to be careful about targeting. You're going to have to do harm reduction. And we actually know how harm reduction, what kinds of strategies of harm reduction work. We've done that with tobacco and alcohol already. With tobacco, one of the great achievements of the last 30 years is we denormalized it. It's not in movies anymore. You can hardly smoke it anywhere. I mean, we've kind of regulated it in such a way that it's not normal to do. If you talk to these same people 30 years ago, all my friends smoked, and that's not true anymore. So, I mean, there are things that we should do from a public health standpoint if we go forward with this that are going to basically help us manage the downside. And there are downsides. All drugs have downsides. And when you use drugs, you're going to have some people in the population are going to misuse it, and some of those people who misuse it are going to become addicted. And one of the nice things from the recent Surgeon General's report is we actually have great definitions and ways to identify people who are addicted. You don't have to have a withdrawal syndrome. You just have to lose control of your use. One of the things that struck me about the Colorado report is the number of people, especially even teenagers, who actually use daily or near daily use. That's a predictor for poor outcomes educationally. They have a much higher risk of not finishing high school. So there's an actual literature out there that we could use to help guide policy from a public health standpoint to mitigate some of the damage. But the decision on to do this is a political decision. It'll be done by a vote, and that's the way it is.
Just to pick up on what Dr. McMillan said, as far as the students go, the weekly or almost near weekly use or even every other day use of marijuana, just a few facts here. Some of the symptoms for the children or for the high school kids or whoever's smoking it, impaired learning, memory loss. They found decreases in math scores, reading. They found a higher percent failure to graduate. Schizophrenic episodes. Again, these are side effects when you introduce something widespread now into a population.
I think this is all really good information from the public health, and we did ask you to come here and talk about it from a public health perspective, but it seems to me that all those things already exist with legal or illegal marijuana. I'm not really sure that those are really super relevant to our discussion. I mean, I agree with you that, and I think everyone would pretty much agree that marijuana and children and kids is a very bad idea, just like alcohol, just like tobacco. I guess more specifically, and when we discussed this before, I don't know if this is questions, who would be able to answer this question? The bigger question for me is if we had a retail store, a legal retail store, how would that, in North Andover, how would that affect the public health as opposed to would it create more of an incentive for or access for children? Would it decrease the black market? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, those are kind of the questions. And I don't pretend to know that you have answers to those or that I have answers to those. Those are more the questions in my mind that we're thinking. And if we did zone for marijuana, where's a good place to zone for it? Are there public health benefits to putting everything in a certain spot or just spreading them out? And I don't know, so I'm putting you on the spot here. You don't have to answer all those questions, but those are the kind of things where, at least for me, I was thinking about, rather than, marijuana has bad effects on children.
Right. Well, I think you should approach it the same way you might approach how many liquor licenses do you want to tap? You have a certain number of liquor licenses. Every time somebody wants to put in another liquor license, say, well, what are the downside effects? You have more access.
Unfortunately, so I agree we don't actually have control over that.
Right, you don't have control over it, but the town does in the licensing board and things like that. And those sorts of things do need to be taken into account.
Sure.
So if you increase access, you might increase, the number of drunk driving episodes, for example. So your point about it being legal or illegal is well taken. And it's really, part of it's a political question, but, by you are normalizing it, I think is probably one of the insights that's come out of looking into this a little bit.
Does it help to, so I agree with that actually, and I know in some cities and towns, at least with tobacco, they've made 21 plus regulations to even go into stores that sell tobacco, which I think is that I think goes to your normalization point, that instead of bringing children who are 4 or 5 in when you go buy a pack of cigarettes, they're not seeing that all the time. And so by the time that they get further in their development, it's not kind of ingrained that, hey, we go buy cigarettes, And to me, that's something, with marijuana, even potentially with alcohol, that are ways to kind of approach it, at least from a zoning or public policy perspective, when something is legal.
Well, I was just going to say, when you're opening up a store, like Dr. McMillan said, there's increased temptation now. So it's almost like opening up a candy store for something that that wasn't available before, but is available now. Very difficult in that regard, as Dr. McMillan said, as far as the possible increased usage, as you would opening up any other type of store that might sell a substance that can cause people to lose focus, to drift, wander their mind, and possibly harm themselves in an accident.
A couple of things that came out of the Colorado information, though, is access by underage children. So you have parents who have it in the home, and what they found is about 18% of parents don't secure it. So that's 1 in 5 practically. So 1 in 5 people aren't securing it. It's available. So whether it's in the bud form or whether it's in an edible, it turns out that's a problem. So you're going to increase that. The other part of it is that about a similar percentage of people will use it in the presence, so you're exposing them also to secondhand smoke. So it really comes down to a numbers game. You are normalizing it and you're making it more available. The use will increase. Many people will use it without any detrimental effects, but there's that small number of people. And then just the last point I'd like to make about addiction is it's really important that people understand that the human brain is primed in a much more susceptible way between the ages of 12 and 25. That was news to me, and that's from the Surgeon General's report. 12 years old, I think, makes sense to us, but I think very few of us thought that 25, you're still in that age of vulnerability. So if you were going to design some kind of regulation, you might want to take that into account, or at least target your interventions to that population, because if you can delay the first use, your likelihood of getting addiction is much lower. And we also know from the Surgeon General's report that for people under the age of 14 who get exposed to a substance, any substance, their likelihood of having a substance use disorder in the next 7 years, I think was the statistic that I saw, is 70%. That's frightening.
Mr. Chair, if I might, I was listening to your conversation. That makes me think that
going forward, the Board of Selectmen has to put together some sort of a host agreement. I mean, I know I'm talking about 1600 Osgood here as opposed to just the overall bylaw. However, it just occurs to me we might make a suggestion through the Board of the Health that part of the host agreement would include some sort of financing that goes towards a public education. Because if we're going to be having, you know, retail, or even if we don't have retail within the town, seems to me that that would be a wonderful way to spend dollars, since it doesn't seem to be coming from the state at this point, that an educational program would be sort of a must.
I think that'd be money well spent. And look, I mean, tobacco's legal, alcohol's legal. The state voters have said that cannabis is legal. So that's the world we're looking into. And I think the public health perspective is that, first of all, we want to understand what the problem is, and we want to mitigate it to the best of our ability. And I think that that's the approach that, you know, your board, our board, all of our boards should take as we kind of move into this new world. It's really, I wouldn't say it's uncharted because Colorado has an experience, but Massachusetts is not Colorado. There are cultural differences, and so we're going to have to figure out some of this on our own. But there is a body of evidence that we can refer to so that we're not making these decisions emotionally, and we're making them based on evidence. And I think you just take that evidence into account as you decide whatever you decide to do. But I think this decision will be clear.
Yeah, the Colorado report was from 2014 and 2016. So then they'll be coming out with their updated report in another couple of years. But it's something to go by. There's not a lot out there. But this is, as Frank said, this is the pure statistics as to what happened from prior to when they legalized it statewide.
We'll take it anyway.
I think that, at least for us, one of the things also to consider there, I think signage, that kind of goes into signage in terms of the normalization and things like that. For any of these types of establishments, how to regulate that and how to, and then where to place them, I think that those are important considerations, and I think that's a really good kind of point of view to also take.
There's just one last point I'd like to make about the design. So however you approve design, if you disapprove the design at all, I really have no experience. I've never been inside one of these grow facilities, but from talking to people who have, apparently the smells are unbelievable and they stick to you. They're on your clothes. You know, it's overwhelming. I don't know what a 1 million square foot facility is going to produce as far as odors, but you're going to have to come up with some kind of way of mitigating the ventilation of those odors, and you have to be mindful of the neighbors of those. And that actually is a legitimate regulatory place where the public health department has a say. It's a noise. It's potentially a noisome issue that whether it's sound, noises, smells. Those things are considered noisome, and those are legitimately addressed by the public health department.
Definitely.
So we have asked quite a few questions about odor control. We also sought information from Colorado that in some areas odors were a problem. And what we have been shown is a system which essentially is a building inside of a building, and carbon filtration systems that we are told can address that. And that was good to hear. I share the concern, including from firsthand experience, that not using, but in another capacity, in the Coast Guard, being able to smell marijuana from 2 miles away at sea, 12 tons that was inside the hold of a smuggling vessel, and the odor is so noxious that it comes out of the hull into the air, and you can smell it 2 miles away. So it really is a very strong odor.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate you coming. I think, the more we talk about this topic, I think the more we learn, and every perspective is slightly different, but they all inform each other. So I think you've given us some good food for thought tonight. We really appreciate you coming.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Gina, I'm going to go right to the thing. We get
Okay.
people. Yeah. So we thank you all for your patience. We now are going to hear the Varsity Wireless special permit application. The process that we're going through is that first Gene, the planner, will take us through an update of recent events and just set the table. We'll ask the applicant to speak because they have some new information. The board will ask questions, and then we will try to get some of your questions on the table, and we'll spend as much time as we need to hear your points of view.
Okay, so this is an application for Varsity Wireless for 122 Foster Street. The application is for a wireless facility special permit. A little housekeeping from the last meeting. The town engineer has submitted response comments for the stormwater review. All his comments have been addressed. He's asked for some minor changes to the plans that the applicant can address. First, I want to make sure the applicant has entered the room. Bonnie, can you also get Brian Grossman? I'm sorry. Sorry, Brian, I'm just introducing the project. So the stormwater review comments have come back from the town engineer. All stormwater comments have been addressed. There's a couple of minor changes to the plans requested that Attorney Grossman can speak to. Over the course of this past week, several emails have been received. They've all been added to the packet, some of which only today. So I've included hard copies for everyone of anything that has been submitted in terms of either flyers, YouTube video link, newspaper article links, and email correspondence. And I provide Attorney Grossman a copy of those as well. The question regarding 61A land was raised at the last meeting. This property is, and the location of the cell tower is within 61A land. Again, the applicant is going to speak to that tonight. The parcel is approximately 11.5 acres, 10.5 acres of which is in 61A, 1 acre is not. The applicant has submitted what he called supplemental number 2 in your package, which includes some revised site plans, and that is the vast majority of what he'll be presenting tonight. And there's one note I'd like to inform the board of in the event that people are not aware. So the board has 150 days on this application to take final action. The application was submitted on August 17th. So 150 days roughly comes to January 12th. I didn't count the days, but my projection is right around January 12th, which is a Friday. As you know, the applicant is also before the Zoning Board of Appeals. They've held one hearing and they've conducted one site visit. Their next meeting will be Tuesday night. And I will also note that as you hear evidence tonight and obviously public comment tonight, I will offer to you that if you'd like to have our wireless consultant at the next meeting, I can arrange for that. So as you hear this, he does participate in reviewing the meetings. He did submit some comments for this meeting in regards to the supplemental information that was provided, as well as some public comment.
Okay.
So.
And Gene, what is that? Can you just describe what the process is for that peer reviewer? Who hires them? How that works?
So the town hires him. He's a consultant. We establish an escrow account where the applicant funds that escrow account, and we pay the consultant through that.
Okay. And that the consultant did submit supplemental. I thought I saw that in the packet. Was that right?
Their second review comments were submitted.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks.
Before we start, Suzanne, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but any general comments as we begin the discussion tonight that we should be aware of from your perspective?
Well, I think the important thing to consider here is that any decision you make has to be made on what's before you, what's in the record before you, and that's sort of should be the basis of your decision-making process. So if you have any questions, if you have any concerns about anything, just make sure that is something that you actually have before you. I think that's important to keep in mind.
Okay.
Yes,
go ahead, Pete.
Comment of town council?
Yes.
So is it possible, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but is it possible for you to frame, in the case of an applicant citing a wireless tower, how much leeway does the town or the town board have, and what are sort of the broad criteria? In other words, what part of this is by right and we don't get a say, and what part do we get a say?
So the one thing that's important to keep in mind is that the Telecommunications Act prohibits towns, I'm going to use the word prohibits twice, from prohibiting a wireless tower if that would then sort of prohibit completely any wireless coverage in that area. So as you know, the applicant is showing you that there is a need for coverage. There's a lack of coverage or a gap. And so if what the board cannot do is deny the application without any information or anything before you that shows that there's an alternative or that they have not made any effort to look for an alternative location or that there is no coverage. So that's the one thing you can't do that. But you can certainly look at the zoning bylaw and the concerns under the zoning bylaw and ask for, you are within your authority to ask for alternative locations and to have that established, whether or not there are alternative locations. Okay.
Okay, great.
Before we get started, just as a point of clarification, has the zoning board of appeals met on this yet, or is that still?
They have not, as Jean said, they have had one meeting, but I know that they have not made a decision yet.
Thank you.
And those variances are before them.
Thank you.
Just, I guess, a follow-up on that. The part of the special permit and part of the bylaw is these height regulations and things that the ZBA is considering. Once they consider that, if they deny the application, then there's nothing really for us to talk about. But if they allow the variances, so meaning you can now go forward, how much can we then consider those same criteria if they've been granted a variance?
So if they've been granted a variance, you wouldn't, so if they've been granted a variance for the fall.
For the height.
For the height.
Yeah, say
For
for
the
the
height. Then, so you have certain considerations within the special permit zoning bylaw that you can look at in terms of height, and that's the aesthetic and
but much more limited.
those concerns. Okay. That's your special permit criteria, and that's a discretionary criteria. And a variance is just whether or not it says, the bylaw states that it shall be X number of feet for a fall line, right? And so once the ZBA, if they were to grant a variance for that, then that would no longer be your consideration. Well, to say, we're going to deny this because you don't meet that criteria as a matter of point, but you could look at the additional criteria that are laid out within the special permit considerations.
I think part of what we're getting to is the sequencing of the decisioning, and I'm absolutely hardcore of the persuasion that we don't vote this until after the ZBA votes the variance. There's no way I would consider approving something with this subject to a variance because it's such a fundamental, basic part of what we're looking at. So at least that's my view of how we do it. If it were just a technical minor variance and it was immaterial, I'd say maybe a different way, but it's core to the entire decision, and we can't make a valid decision until we hear from them. So I don't know if anybody else has strong opinions about that, but that's agreed. Yeah.
Agreed.
Okay, good. So I guess with that, technology usually works. Yeah. Okay. Jake, can you plug it in from where you are? Or?
You brought a USB.
Yeah.
Can you test these?
Pass these around.
Fine. We ran into the opposite technical difficulty last time, so I had to use this way. So how do you pass by Bluetooth?
Kind of scary. Kind of scary. We have like a white powder. Do these all part of the record?
This looks like one of the things that we just
have it on a USB?
Or you should have put it up on yours. I mean, yeah.
Oh, I don't know, that was the other one, but that's not gonna-
That is correct. And it's like Nathan told Megan, he was very happy.
Grab that. I'm not an IT person.
Funny, we've gotten used to everything working all the time.
We get to see everybody's screensavers.
Yeah, I know. Snazzy screensavers.
Gotta be careful about
Are
your
you
screensavers.
working off of a pitch, or is there anything you can go through that doesn't require us looking at it? Or?
It'd be helpful to have the
Okay.
presentation.
So what? I'll probably have to drag these onto my drive.
So you're going to
Just that talk about club.
Which one? The top one?
Hard for me to
One just done. So it might be-
at age 8, he does Hebrew school. Which is tough for us and my wife. Although the twins at home, it just been too much. Talked about it. Yes.
Give them their shot.
I don't know the level of the bug really. If it's just plain water or if it's actually like coaching and things like that. I just don't know.
presentation.
I don't quite think of it.
Yes, what does that mean? Which means what? So it wasn't the first one?
I'm just going to refer to the first one too. But that's the main one. If you're casting, you need your computer.
I don't need my...
Pre-meetings, right? I think it's like...
Sure.
This isn't a commentary on the effectiveness of the cell tower, is it? Is that on?
No, but
These went, because mine's narrowed, there's yours. There you go. Yeah.
Is that inside your I'm just looking at this picture here. What's that? That's in Persian. Trying to get out there. It's state, that's all artificial.
Isn't that amazing? You see the whole thing of this like big flower?
It's all our money every time you buy gas. It is.
How are you?
Absolutely incredible.
Yep. Yeah, come on with the Money Club. We're a friendly group.
Saturdays are hard to
Yeah.
it's almost done. So.
It's nothing worse than your stuff doesn't work. It's awful. I mean, seriously, it's just, it's killer. You're all ready to go, your stuff doesn't work. It is hard.
You can ride on the road in Denver once a year.
Did you tour any marijuana facilities?
I didn't have enough time. I didn't have enough time.
Didn't have enough time.
I did. It was funny though. I was talking to somebody. There's an enormous amount of growth out there. The metropolitan area has increased to 100,000 a year, and so somebody was asking, well, when did it start? It actually started. There was a certain increase, and part of the increase in the population is due to the the change in the marijuana law. That's what they said. I think at this point it's well beyond that, but
My brother lives there.
yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
We're ready to roll. So, okay. If you could, of course, identify yourself for the record.
Thank you. Brian Grossman, counsel for Varsity Wireless. I'm the law firm of Anderson Krieger. With me, Stephen Kelleher, who is the director of site development for Varsity Wireless. As Gene ran through, we've met. It's our fourth hearing, third substantive. We do have a meeting next week with the Board of Appeals. We've had one meeting with them, kind of sidewalk. And so we have our next meeting with the Board of Appeals next Tuesday. As this board knows, we did a balloon test on 9/23/2017, and we used that to create some photographic simulations. And we have some additional photographic simulations that we've submitted. One of the questions that was raised at the planning board hearing last time had to do with minimum height analysis and what does that mean?
I wish we knew. It's been doing it all meeting, so.
In terms of, is there questions about the overall height of the facility and whether or not Varsity could reduce it in any capacity in order to help mitigate some of the concerns? We have submitted a revised plan package to the planning board. It's also gone to the Board of Appeals as part of their supplement for next week. Varsity can revise the design down to 115 feet. So similar to the original application, that 115 feet is to the top of the faux branches. The top of the tower and top of the AT&T antennas would be 110 feet. And then Verizon would locate at an antenna center line of 97 feet, which is their minimum height, which is verified by your independent consultant. We provided in that package revised photographic simulations, so you have that. I do have some additional slides here that I'd like to walk through that show that and show actually the comparison side by side of the original 135-foot proposal versus the 115-foot proposals. We think that's helpful. One of the other things we did submit as part of the supplement is as part of the visual demonstration, they did two things. They flew the balloon and did the photographic simulations based off of that. But as part of that, as we discussed, what they did is they, utilizing equipment to locate the tower site and so the direction they should be viewing to locate the visual demonstration. That is the radius, about a mile radius of the roads that VSS, the company that did the visual demonstration, the photographic simulations and view shed analysis for Varsity. So you can see in blue all the areas and roads that they traveled. They show the photographic simulation locations. That's the same map in terms of locations that we provided along with the separate photographic simulation package. Part of their demonstration or their package, what they show is The photo locations marked in red, are locations where the balloon and the tower will not be visible from. In some cases, it's just because they thought it was an important location to take a photograph from. We did have some discussions about where the board as well wanted Varsity to ensure that they took photographs from as well. And so the photographic simulation package includes that. In addition, the view shed shows, if you see the areas kind of shaded in green that are off the road, those are the areas based on the visual demonstration and VSS's equipment and their assessment where they think there will be generally predicted visibility. And so as you see up along Bridges Lane, Vestway, they don't have predicted visibility. There's a couple, except for the lower portion where picture 7 was taken from, which is about 11 Bridges Lane. But to walk through, this isn't the entire photographic simulation package. We've gone through those before. But so on the left, my left, you have what's marked as Simulation 1. Simulation 1 is always the original site as proposed at 135 feet. The site location has not moved. Nothing has changed about the site location other than the potential overall height. And so on the right, you have Simulation 2, and you can see the distinct difference between the 135-foot and the 115 feet. It just appears just above the treetops and is significantly lower than surrounding vegetation. Similar from 46 to 160 Foster Street. On the left, it's still about even with the top of the tree on the right there. And then when you drop it to 15 feet, it's again just above the treetop of that tree line that's just in front of it. We discussed this picture at length, I think, at one of the last hearings in terms of the view from the ball field. Again, on the left is the 135 feet. On the right is the 115 feet. As we discussed, it certainly doesn't make it invisible, but we think the 20-foot reduction is significant, helps bring it down closer to the tree line, helps reduce the overall visuals from the athletic field.
You know, I got to admit, I'm looking at all these, and they don't feel right. Go back to the one before. That looks like a lot more than 15 feet off. Maybe I'm wrong, but...
It's 20 feet.
Okay.
So why does it say 130 versus 115?
Top. So it was, that's my mistake. It's 130 to the top of the tower. The 135 is the top of those branches. And then the 115 is to the top of the branches.
So you're saying this is a typo. It should say 135 versus 115?
Correct. Again, if you look at 98 Huckleberry Lane, which is about a half mile away in terms of the visual, it brings it below the peak of the house, actually brings it about in line or even a little bit lower than the trees that are the same tree line that's off to the right. And this was a photo location that was requested by the board on Blue Ridge Road. Again, you can see it brings it significantly closer to the existing tree line. Again, that's about a mile away in terms of overall distance when you're considering impact. One of the questions the board asked had to do with comparison of this site versus other existing towers in North Andover in terms of height. The existing Chestnut Street Tower is 152 feet tall. That's marked by that red dot there, as you can see from the overview in terms of overall location. There's significantly more homes surrounding it. I pulled this from the North Andover GIS. It's really the same view in terms of location. It's about, and this is scaled off of using the GIS, so these are approximate. It's about 95 feet or so to that southerly property line, and it's just about 220 feet to that property line to the west. But again, you can see the density of development surrounding it. And one of the questions was, how does this compare in terms of height to existing towers?
The 152 feet is from where to where?
That is from the ground to the top of the tower. I believe there are a couple of whip antennas that stick up above it to about 162, but I just went to the height of the top.
I also think that tower existed prior to any of our bylaws in town. It's almost a legacy structure.
That may be true, but again, in terms of you asked in general, how does this compare to the
Fair
other
enough,
existing
fair enough.
sites?
I'm just trying to add a little bit more context. Sure.
Again, we did a little bit more of a comparison using the town's GIS system, and one of the nice things about it is it lets you
See, now you're stretching it a little bit too much, because that's something that existed before the bylaw. This is something that's now, so, you know, but
it's still part of the overall analysis of what exists. You asked the question, what exists in Andover, in North Andover. We're showing you what exists in North Andover. As you can see, there's significantly more density surrounding the Chestnut Street than the proposed site at Foster Street. Again, there's also the existing tower at 691 Johnston Street. That's about 185 feet tall. And again, in terms of distance, that site is pretty close to the existing property line, and so it certainly doesn't meet the 185 feet distance. That's about 20 or 30 feet, so about 200 feet or so actually to the nearest residence. So in terms of the proposed facility now, it's still, you know, the distance hasn't changed, so the height has, though. So it's 115 feet, and we're 135 feet to the nearest property line. And again, just showing the comparison in terms of number of properties surrounding the site. That is to the property, not to the site itself. And again, the Foster Street is significantly less in terms of overall density. One of the questions the board had to do with overall height and minimum, and whether or not Verizon could utilize a facility that was shorter than the original 135 feet proposed. Now remember, as far as the application goes, Varsity is actually the second carrier down. Verizon is the second carrier down on the Varsity Tower. There's AT&T has a lease for the top spot. The gray shows the site at 57 feet, so that's actually below the existing tree line. You can see the blue, the added coverage that comes from 77 feet rather. The yellow is added at 97 feet, and then the incremental coverage from 97 to 117, which was the original proposed height for Verizon, is shown in red.
So when I see this, I'm sorry, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
When I see this map, comparing the gray to the blue to the yellow to the red, what it says to me is diminishing returns with added height. That the bulk of your coverage is obtained at the lowest height, and then a small percentage increase at the next level, blue, an even smaller percentage increase at the next level, and then a very small added increase at the highest level. Just looking at the area colored.
I would disagree with that. You get a significant footprint change from 57 to 77, and even out to 97. It almost really doubles that footprint.
From gray to blue, you're saying the blue doubles the size of the gray?
No, so when you add the blue and the yellow together. When you look north and east, it's a significant distance and increase in an area that doesn't have coverage. The site doesn't work at 57 feet for Verizon Wireless. They would not construct it. The board's consultant confirms the analysis supports the 97-foot height for Verizon, and then talks about the board's, the bylaws requirement for co-location as well. So it's not just Varsity and Verizon saying 97 feet is required. Your consultant agrees.
So can I have another question here?
Sure, go ahead.
For town council, with respect to the comment about the bylaw requirement for co-location on the antenna. By co-location, you mean multiple antenna arrays on the antenna. Is that what you mean by co-location?
Correct.
So I think this is our fourth meeting, and we or I have been asking this question at every meeting, and I'm still not satisfied with the answers as to the requirement and the flexibility on the number of arrays on this tower. Because if there was only one array, then the height of the bottom could be the maximum height of the antenna. So from my perspective, one of the reasons driving the height of this antenna is the interest to have 4 arrays. So I just think I heard you say requirement of the bylaw for co-location, and so I'm asking for advice if we can. I'm sorry that I put you on the spot, but what exactly is the requirement for co-location of multiple arrays, and what flexibility do we have as a board on that point?
Can I clarify one thing?
Sure.
So with the reduced height, we're planning for at least 3. And there's two things I think we talked about this before. There's structural capacity, and then there's usable height.
Right.
So with the revised plan, there's now 3 arrays. There's 3 arrays shown. So you have AT&T at the top. You have Verizon at 97, and we
So
plan
you've
for
gone
one
from
additional.
4 to 3.
The original was 5.
5 to 3.
Right.
Thank you.
But the 97 and 107 are driven by need. The third co-location spot is actually on the bottom, and that's the one that would potentially be available for another carrier if this met their need.
Right, so I'm just trying to get to the comment you made about the requirement in the bylaw for co-location and asking for some advice.
Right, so I think that if the applicant is citing to some requirement in the bylaw that there has to be, that the bylaw requires the board to grant a special permit for co-location, I think that we would like a cite to that, because I'm not quite sure what you mean. I mean, I think that's the problem, is what is the meaning of that statement? And I think what you have on your slide is not that there is a requirement, but that there is an expectation of co-location.
Yeah, but I think it's even
to be clear, I'm
less-
quoting your consultant on that.
No, I know, but I think that
Actually, what I think I heard you say verbally was not what's on your slide. What I thought I heard you say verbally was not an expectation, but I thought you said a bylaw requirement. And so that's what I'm reacting to get the town council opinion.
So what the bylaw says is licensed carriers shall share wireless service facilities in sites where feasible and appropriate, thereby reducing the number of wireless service facilities that are standalone facilities. It goes on from there. The point, I take it, being that we want less towers. I don't think that means that every tower has to have co-location.
Yes, exactly.
I also think that it's somewhat disingenuous to say a bylaw requires it when you're asking for 8 different waivers or variances for things from the bylaws. So I think, to your point, Peter, is that it would certainly be feasible under the bylaw, either as if they wanted to, as a variance, or I don't think that's even necessary as something where it wasn't required by the board. I think generally the board would want it as a general rule. If the more you can get on there, then the idea would be the less towers you need. But in weighing the factors, more potential towers in different areas versus height of a particular tower, I think it's fair.
So, but in terms of overall design, originally what we'd come with was the 135 feet to provide for a greater capacity for co-location. At 115 feet, it's providing Verizon at 107, I'm sorry, 97, AT&T at 107, and that third spot is not the one that's driving the height. The one that's driving the height are AT&T and Verizon with the minimum with Verizon's minimum of 97.
But part of what I'm hearing is that theoretically it could work at 97 feet.
Verizon would be going at 97 feet.
So the
And then
antenna could
AT&T
work,
would be above that.
but the antenna could work at 97 feet and still have 2 arrays.
No, wait, let me clarify. Verizon's array would be located at 97 feet. You cannot co-locate AT&T and Verizon in the same vertical space. So AT&T and Verizon would not both be at 97 feet.
I understand
So
that.
there needs to be the vertical separation.
Right.
So the way
So
the current tower is proposed.
One of the 2 of you would have to take the lower spot.
No, AT&T doesn't work at 87. It needs to be at either 97 or 107.
So then Verizon would take the lower spot.
But Verizon's minimum, as supported by the consultant, is 97 feet.
And now
So at 97 feet as the floor, one goes at 97, one goes at 107.
So I follow your logic. I just have a hard time agreeing with it. So the other area that, and I don't want to interrupt your presentation, but that I've been unsatisfied with is we asked what I thought was a question to inform the board on whether or not this tower could be replaced in part or in whole by the telephone pole top antennas. And I have to say that the response we got was not much better than sarcasm. And I'm still not satisfied with that response. So if you tell me that the minimum height is 97, my question back to you, somewhat repeating the earlier question, is how many of those telephone pole top antennas would you need to put in so that you could make it work at that lower height?
And the answer you got was from Verizon's attorney, who's not here. But the answer from Verizon is that those pole top antennas are not for the broad-based macro coverage that this site is providing. They provide capacity, not coverage. And when you look at the coverage area that's being sought to be covered here, the poles are below the height of the trees. They will not provide any sort of coverage really beyond the ribbon of coverage that's on that would be on the road itself. It's not going to reach onto the ball field. It's not going to reach to properties that are on the other that are removed like 135 to 100 feet off of the road. And so that was part of Verizon's answer. Is it's that technology is not, they're not utilizing it for coverage. It's a capacity.
I think that's only responding to the portion of the question which was, what would it take to replace the tower in whole? And I think is unresponsive to the portion of the question which is, if you're using a reduced height, what could those telephone pole top antennas do for just the remaining portion, not in whole, just in part? And I don't think we ever got the answer to that.
Again, I would respectfully disagree. I think Verizon's answer is that those are not for coverage. They are for capacity. You're not going to get more coverage from them.
I hear
You're
your
going to
answer.
get capacity.
Yeah, I hear your answer.
I just had a separate question. Were you going to look for something, or did you have an answer? I just had a separate question, not for you, if you're looking for something. Part of the bylaw says it shouldn't be located within 300 feet of a scenic road, but I can't find a definition of scenic road. Do you know if there is one?
I don't believe it. I think that's a bylaw. I'll look into it, but I think that's a bylaw to accept scenic roads, and I don't think we have that. But I'll have to look at it.
Yeah, I mean, that gets into one of those definitional things that we talked about earlier.
I couldn't find a definition of scenic roads, so I just...
I know under the state law there's a scenic...
Usually an accepted scenic road.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just don't think we have that in town.
So then we don't have any accepted scenic roads.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
I
Just
think it
curious.
came up only a few years ago, and I don't think we accepted it. But I will look into it.
No, he's talking about the grid utility pole. That's not what it's. He's talking about the grid station. Grid stations.
Okay, did you have more slides to go through, or you finished the main party presentation?
No, other than, again, one of the questions that came up, and it's the last slide I have to go through, had to do with the national grid stanchions to the far west, not the short utility poles, but the further ones to the east, rather. So Verizon, again, ran coverage plot at 60 feet, which would be an extension of the existing stanchions that are about 55 feet And Verizon's conclusion, again supported by the consultant, is that the existing poles just aren't tall enough to provide coverage to the area.
Now, one of the things that we've talked about, and could you tell us what other options and alternatives you look at and why you chose the one that you chose?
Sure. Obviously, one of the things we did look at were the existing stanchions. There's also the existing National Grid substation area. Steve is the one who did the site acquisition for the facility itself, so I'll have him walk through generally what his process was and how we arrived here.
So in this particular area, we were kind of limited because most of the property had any acreage to it. Designated open space, conservation, public conservation, private conservation, state designated conservation, topography limitations, wetland limitations, etc. So I had done a tremendous amount of work originally trying to find, obviously knowing this would be a difficult site to zone, to try to find a site that would meet the bylaw. Obviously, you're trying to first try to get away from any variances to the point that you can. The height variance, that's a typical thing we have to get because 10 feet above the tree, even confirmed by your consultant, in most communities that's just not going to work from a propagation standpoint. So as I drilled into it, I looked at the fields across the way where the soccer fields are. Even if they had been available, which they're not, they have some restrictions on them with the open space and the deed and conservation restrictions. But from a visual perspective, this is, just if you think the town is visible, looking at the site from the soccer fields, imagine what it would be like if it's on a soccer field where the tree height probably averages 20 feet over there. So that's a whole. There's probably 5 or 6 parcels from one end of Boxford Street all the way up to the grid poles. Some of it's private, most of it's town, some of it's conservation, but that whole area was out. I looked further out. We looked at some properties around the utility lines, but again, there's the grid. A lot of the grid parcels are landlocked. Location-wise, it's not ideal because we're basically getting further and further away from the coverage objective, which Boxford and Salem Street. I think we're at anywhere from 0.6 to 0.8 miles away from the current location. The folks up on Bridge and Vestway would, again, if you think the tower's visible from where we are, if you put it up in the open space up there, those residents would have a tremendous impact. So, yeah. So long story, and then going on the other side of Boxer Road is a hill. So if you're coming up Gloucester towards Boxer Salem Road and go across, there's a lot of there's some high ground there. It goes up to about 300 feet. But again, that's a mix of town and state-owned designated conservation land. So then you get into what's available in the area that has. Obviously, there's no commercial or industrial property, which is always a preference. And so what has any land to it that you could possibly get some setbacks? I mean, the tower's never going to be invisible. But what you can get for setbacks from residences, try to hide it enough where we could still keep some tree cover, which we were able to keep some of the pines there, which is important because you take some of those pines out and it ends up popping a lot worse than it is now. So when I met Mr. Young, we walked the site, and this is going back a couple years now because it's been an ongoing process for us, and obviously expecting that there'd be some people that were opposed, but given some of the areas that, for one, at the end of the day, this ended up being the only site that would, one, meet the objective, and two, was available to lease. Even if the town there's just not, you can't go on a designated or open space or conservation land. So. And I think if you look at the affidavit and the site evaluation form that I did, there's 20 plus sites that I looked at. Some sites there's 100 sites. Other sites there's maybe only 5 properties that might make sense. And in this case, just digging into the deeds and other things that are important, and knowing that that the board's going to have these questions, trying to do this due diligence to make it, you're not going to please everybody, but for this case, one, I got the only site that was available, and two, it makes the most sense given where we are. I mean, even if the fields were available and I had to choose, then the choice would be to go into the trees and try to minimize the visual impact for as many people as possible. And I think when we further reduce the height, because I was out there with the balloon, I think I had missed you folks, but I came right after you guys, but I was out there the day of the balloon test and drove around. And so it's not invisible from the ball field. Obviously, I know that Mr. Simmons had some comments on that originally, but we try to do our best to mitigate it. The tree design is big. I mean, it's better than a monopole. It's still a big, tall tree that obviously is not a tree, but your bylaw calls for it. And I think with the extensive, the bylaw is extensive, and to the extent that we could, we tried to meet as much as we could around the bylaw. I think subsequently what I did, I don't know if you showed the slide, but there was some concerns. We had a site walk with the zoning board subsequent to yours that there were some concerns that you'd see it from Foster Street. Just driving by, you'd look over to the left, especially this time of year. So what we added to the proposal was a row of aprovites along the street, and then a second row to the other side of our driveway. So if you can see, looking up, you'll see a row of trees that will grow to 10 to 15 feet tall. Then you'll look up and see another row of trees that will 10 to 15 feet tall, and then there'll be a fence behind that, and you'll have a brown barked monopole with a tree design. So from the street in that particular area, just looking up at the compound, nobody will see it at any time of the year from the ground. And I feel like, given the extensive work we did, I mean, we found the site, the only site that's available to meet this need and to meet the gap in coverage.
On that point, though, in terms of need, it sounds like you've been working at this a couple of years. Who defined the problem that there was a coverage gap here? Was that Varsity Wireless? Was it Verizon, AT&T, another carrier?
Well, so we have a site in Boxford, and we had some obviously interest in that site, and then as we got going there, the need building off that site, because if you look at I think we're 2 miles or so from that site, but from the rest of the sites in town, I think we're 3, 4, 5 miles from. So there's a large swath, but when you look at building off of Boxford, the site gets defined by because typically the carriers define the need. We're a tower developer, so we're vertical real estate, so we lease, think of an apartment building. We're building a building and we lease space. So obviously we wouldn't want to build a facility in an area that nobody wanted. So we're deferring to the carriers to define the need, and then we provide the infrastructure for them to go on and propagate their signals.
Do you know if there's a specific carrier that asked you to investigate this area?
Well, AT&T, so basically in this scenario, AT&T had been looking. I think they had spoken with one of the board members or relatives from the ZBA. I forget his name. I think that's why he recused himself, or maybe. But so they were looking in an area, and we had subsequently been looking, and so it just ultimately ended up we found the site first. So AT&T defined the need originally, if that makes sense. And then subsequent to our application in Boxford, Verizon was interested in the location, and that's how we ended up.
Could you talk about the Chapter 61A issue?
Wait, can I pause on this question and keep going here? I guess in terms of defining the problem and where coverage is needed, when I'm looking at this, is the white the area where there is currently no coverage on this image?
It's inadequate coverage, correct?
Inadequate coverage. So how is it that you sort of drew the circle of here's where we need coverage and decided this is where we're going to look? Like, why wasn't it shifted more north or more east? How is it that it got to be in that particular location where there is so much conservation area, as opposed to, even if you moved it, say 5 miles up, you might still capture some of the same area, you know, but just shift the center, and then maybe you're looking at a whole new different set of locations as a possibility.
Well, right, and ultimately, the carriers define what their needs are. So to your point, if you shifted 5 miles, then you're not covering any part of this area. You know, so you're not going to get that much propagation out of a site to get 5 miles, especially in an area like this, where you're running the 4G and you're with the topography and the tower heights, you're not going to be able to build. I mean, even if you build 190, it's not going to. It doesn't. You know, just because you're building that much taller structure doesn't mean the signals propagate exponentially up, because there's a limit to how far they go. But in this case, the defined need, you know, with AT&T, you're looking at the homes back up off Vest and Bridge, but more predominantly the busy roads covering the traffic on Boxford and Salem. I mean, so it's always a mixture of what the need is. It's not necessarily just one or the other. And so if you shift it out, you know, to the north 2 miles, and there may be a site down the road that somebody needs there if this site doesn't meet that need. But that, and it's just the carriers define the need and based off of.
Yeah. So the coverage objective here is Foster Street, some of Boxford Street, Salem, and then the surrounding areas, including Bridges Lane, Bestway, in terms of providing the in-building coverage. And so, given the physics, the location becomes proximate to the area that you're trying to cover.
So if I could follow up, I think I heard you just say the busy roads.
Busy roads.
Right. And again, I'm not suggesting I have as much expertise on this as you do, but we did hear an applicant to put in the telephone pole top antennas. Not you, previously. And I'm pretty sure they told us that was to service needs on locations like busy roads. So I feel like I'm hearing two different things here. If part of what the carrier, AT&T, is telling you is a need for busy roads, why couldn't that part of the need be covered by telephone pole top antennas? I know I'm using the wrong term, but earlier I'm hearing that could not service any of the need. So what I'm trying to get to here is there a solution that is a combination, particularly when I hear you talk about busy roads?
No, so let me be clear. The coverage, as we talked about, the coverage objective includes roads and also primarily in-building coverage in this area in the residences. So part of the coverage on the road, because of the way the signal propagates, right? So it provides coverage on the road because the road is near the site, and it provides coverage on the roads that the houses are on, because in order to provide coverage into the houses, you pass over the road. But the height driver and the site driver is not, the height won't change based on being able just to provide coverage on, say, Foster Street with a couple small cells along the road, because you're still not reaching the houses along that road.
Have you done that analysis?
Well, even your consultant says there does not appear to be a practical way to simply add more nodes to the utility poles to provide the macro scale coverage sought from the new tower facility.
So I read that as well, and there's an awful lot of words in there, seems, qualifying words. So that's why I'm asking if you've done the analysis.
Again, I go back to Verizon's answer. Their answer is they're not. Those uses are for capacity. And if you look at the coverage footprint and you look at what's trying to be covered, particularly to the north along the northeast on Vest and Bridge, that area is covered from the macro coverage, and you're getting the roads as a byproduct, but you're covering indoors from the macro coverage. So overall it's a combined objective. But the driver that you're looking at as trying to cover just the roads is not the part that's driving the height.
So is it fair to say that Verizon is primarily concerned with serving and maybe perhaps AT&T as well, but Verizon is concerned about serving the homeowners, where, and the residual effect is that people traveling on Foster Street, Salem, Boxford Street would also benefit from the tower's location?
It's a dual coverage objective, but the primary objective is the in-building coverage for both AT&T and Verizon. I think we talked about it maybe at the original hearing in terms of, the way the industry has progressed is now, and the number in, I think it was 2005, the amount of data usage being used was so low that it wasn't even tracked. And now, as of like 2015, it's in the trillions of gigabytes. So, and that shift, part of that dynamic shift now is you used to be, cell phones were a matter of convenience, and maybe you needed it on the road, maybe you needed it outside. Almost no one used it at home. More than 50% of the United States now is either wireless only, which is 49.3%, or wireless dominant, which means you have a landline, but no one really calls you on it, and I fall squarely into that category. If you're calling my house, you don't know me, because I'm not going to answer it. It's going to be my cell phone. That's wireless dominant. I have a landline. I don't use it. When you factor in wireless dominant, it's over 60%. And so in order to meet subscriber demand, the carriers have to be able to provide coverage indoors.
But isn't there really an offsetting effect here that, yes, more demand for data, but as 4G evolves into 5G, that there's going to be an offsetting effect. And in the meantime, we're going to have a big, huge tower that doesn't have the demand it used to have because the system that will replace 4G will have more capacity.
No, it's going to be the reverse. So 5G is all about providing additional capacity and additional speed. And so the uses for 5G will be more data intensive, not less. And so demand is going to increase, not decrease.
Can tower heights be change topic? Can tower heights be increased?
What do you mean?
So if you built a 100-foot tower, 110-foot tower, 5 years from now, if you wanted to add coverage, could you make that up to 130?
If you plan in advance and design the foundation and the structure to accommodate it, yes.
So that's possible?
It is possible.
Okay. So was anything like that, we're going up, you talked about the different places you considered, and some of the existing structures you considered, was increasing height considered on any current structures, current cell towers?
No. Can you increase? You're asking if you can increase any of the existing cell towers.
Well, I'm asking both. I'm asking both. If you were to build the one you're talking about building, and it built it at 110 feet, which is, I think, or 115 is in the proposal now, and later on realized you wanted more and come back under our bylaw to modify, is that feasible? That's my first question.
If you plan in advance, yes.
Okay. Is it feasible to go back onto old towers and increase the height?
Not generally, especially with some of the existing sites, and particularly North Andover, as we talked about, they're particularly old, and they're already at 185 feet and 152 feet. Carriers kind of are where they are on that, and increasing the height on those, second, given the distance that they are from the location, it's going to have a negligible impact. But AT&T and Verizon don't own or control either of those two towers, or the Osgood Street site as well.
So can you come back to the 61A issue?
Sure. In terms of 61A, the site does have a 61A restriction on it, or part of the property does in general. All that means is that at some point, there is a process under 61A to remove property from 61A. That involves paying some of the rollback taxes going back. Involves a process of including a plan and laying out the plan in terms of what area will be removed. It involves notification to the municipality about the removal and a right of first refusal on behalf of the municipality. But it does not preclude the grant of a special permit or variance for a project. I've done a number of these on 61A land. You can do it either way in terms of taking it out first and then applying, or applying, if you're successful, taking it out second. Typically working with our landowners, taking it out after the fact is preferable from their standpoint. Because obviously if the project doesn't go forward or it's not approved, then they've taken out land from 61A that didn't need to be taken out. But it doesn't mean Varsity doesn't have physical site control enough to bring an application. It's just another piece of the process that Varsity will have to go through before the site can be ultimately constructed.
How do you value the right of first refusal?
Initially, the landowner seeking to remove it doesn't value it. The town does. I'll be candid. She may know more than I do. I'll be candid. Every time a client of mine has sought to remove property from 61A, we haven't gotten to the valuation process. But it involves, typically, obviously, if you were doing the whole property, you do an appraisal of the best use of the property. Here, where you're removing a piece of the property and not all of it, the valuation's a little bit more difficult. We would certainly suggest that the part of that value is, of course, the part of the best use of that property is, of course, the part of the proposed development, and so you would factor that in. But how it ultimately gets valued and would be through the 61A process. There's a process for an appraisal, and if the landowner doesn't agree, they can challenge that appraisal, I believe, at their own.
Okay. I don't think it's as easy as you suggest it is.
It's a very technical process, but it's not a difficult process.
Okay.
I've done it several times. So.
Yeah.
So recently, I think this planning board just considered a 61A notice to convert, and what that involved was that the landowner provided that. It was a purchase and sale agreement. They provided the purchase and sale agreement. So in this instance, this landowner would provide the lease, and so that would be what would be considered. So it would be a right of first refusal on the same terms. So you would see the terms and conditions, and then you would do a value.
Equivalent terms.
Right.
That's what I mean. We've been through a number when we have purchased land, and it's not a simple thing. So.
No, it's definitely not a simple thing. Right.
Okay.
If the town decides to do it, it's not necessarily so simple. When they decline, it's fairly straightforward in terms of the notice and the process.
Any other questions from the board before we?
Yeah, I do.
Pete?
Can you go back to the slide that talks about the consultant recommendation for 97 feet? I know this is just for Verizon, but have you done a comparison of what the pole looks like at 97 feet?
No. Because we have the lease with Varsity has a lease with AT&T, so it already has two carriers, so it's using the 97 and the 107.
So you already have the lease?
Correct.
Any other questions? If not, I know...
One other very quick thing I just want to mention, we did include in the second supplement that was received last week a report from Real Estate Consultants of New England, Mark Carenti, who's here tonight, and Andrew LeMay, doing a real estate impact study for the proposed facility. They utilized data from their prior efforts, as well as also looking at data from North Andover, Middleton, and surrounding towns that are similarly situated, and that their conclusion is that the facility will not have a measurable impact on surrounding property values.
Thank you. Now let's, for those of you who have patiently waited a chance to ask questions, if you could go to the mic, identify yourself and ask your question. We'll see if we can get answers.
Lisa Roberts, 31 Bridges Lane. That tower will sit 1,200 feet off my front door, and I invite you to stand at my front door because your photographs omitted my front door, which will give you a very clear view of that tower. Ugly. So I would like you to come back and take some more photos and perhaps redo that balloon test because you omitted a lot of valuable photos that you should have up there. And speaking to home values, there's homes for sale right now in the neighborhood. And someone had 2 offers coming in that were pulled because our signs went up around the neighborhood. So it absolutely affects the home values, if not just the possibility of selling their home. Because there are people who say, hey, I don't want to live near a cell tower, so don't even include that on my list. So it is an issue. So from October 3rd, your meeting, I have a few quotes I'd like to bring up. You said, I judge a site by the people who oppose me. So I invite you to look at the room now because you clearly have opposition in this room. So if that's how you judge a site, this shouldn't even be here. And there was a false claim that, yeah, the neighbors are excited for it. Nope. Pretty sure you're not going to hear excitement from us. Yeah, there is one person who is for it.
Yes, I mean, let's try to stay away from being personal.
And you also did say that you look for places that aren't residential neighborhoods. And this is smack dab in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And in my terms, a scenic roadway. It's an old farm. It's one of the original farms, continually operated original farms in North Andover. And as you drive down, I actually seek this neighborhood out because it's gorgeous. You drive down and you nearly get a history lesson driving down the road because there's 3 really old homes. Lanny lives in, there she is. She lives in one of them, and she's actually going to talk about the history of the area because it's phenomenal. It's full and rich in history. And this is just going to rob that from the views that we get on a daily basis that we hold dear to our hearts. So aside from history, the natural setting, health issues haven't even been touched upon. I know the studies, they're not long-term right now, so we have no idea, but I certainly have concerns. I'm 1,200 feet away.
The law doesn't allow us to consider.
I know, I just have to state it because I am concerned.
Okay, but just so everyone knows, I think we're going to pretty much let everyone say what they want to say, but we're pretty constricted in what we can consider and what we can't consider, and I think that's why council said at the beginning we're limited to the record. So what's really helpful for us and why we asked a lot of questions of the applicant is stuff that's in the bylaws. So about the coverage, about the aesthetics and the view, about those kind of things are really important, and I think those facts would really be helpful. And I know we did hear a lot about the history and those things before. So new things and also things that really speak to the bylaw are most helpful.
Right. Well, I will speak to coverage, and someone else is going to talk about that soon. I've driven around the neighborhood. I don't drop a call. I've had an entire conversation on the length of Winter Street. No problem. I mean, if I were to try to Google something while on my phone, I don't know if I could do it. I haven't tried because I'm driving. But coverage, I'm a little confused what the difference between capacity and coverage is, because if you want coverage for emergencies or a single phone call going down the street, you have it. Does capacity mean you want multiple busy roadways, traffic going down there, and you want coverage for about 30 people? I don't see that many people on that road.
Do you want to just give us you've been talking about capacity versus coverage. Do you want to give us this definition?
Sure. So coverage in general is whether or not, so if no one is operating, so 3 o'clock in the morning, and there's no one on a facility, no one inside the coverage footprint, can you access the network? Can you Google something and get something in a timely return in terms of throughput? Can you make a phone call? Capacity is, and the best analogy I've always used is, particularly in the old days when the only way to get a ticket was to call Ticketmaster when tickets went on sale. And so you would pick up your phone and you have a dial tone. That's coverage. When you dial and you try and get through to Ticketmaster and you would get that recording that says, all circuits are busy, please try your call again later, that's a capacity issue. And so when you have a large number of users accessing one facility because they're in that facility's coverage footprint, all trying to either make a phone call, and it's all now a combination. So phone calls and data are treated similarly. When they're all accessing the network at once, you can overload the site, and so someone won't be able to access the internet. Someone won't be able to make a phone call. Again, in terms of this does come up a fair amount in terms of people saying, well, I have coverage, I can make a phone call, or I think it's adequate. That kind of anecdotal evidence is not relied on by the courts, is routinely rejected, and they will look at things that are the credible scientific evidence, such as the drive test data and coverage plots that were provided here.
So, I mean, I've heard it described, you know, if you think of, you're at Gillette Stadium, right? And there's you're clearly covered by a cell tower because there's, you know, towers right there. But you're trying to get on the internet and you can't because 50,000 people are using it at the same time. I think that's capacity versus coverage,
Yeah.
for
Right.
definitional.
Right. If you're the only one at Gillette on a Tuesday, you're going to have coverage. When the Patriots are playing and you try and post that photo to Facebook or make a phone call and you can't get through it or it won't post, that's a capacity issue.
So better for definition, so we're not talking about
exactly.
something.
So I have one more piece of clarification from the October 3rd meeting that I'm done. So you mentioned, and you had a lovely analogy with the nail polish brush. The telephone pole topper you said has a reach of 1/3 of a mile, correct?
That was for as the council, but I think that's correct.
Okay. In the same sentence, he said a monopole has 15 square mile reach. And I saw it, your eyes kind of went up like, oh wow. But I don't know if you guys caught, that's square miles. So that's actually 2.185 mile reach, which is 1/3 of a mile. Much closer than the perceived 15-mile reach that at first I heard and said, wait a minute, rewind, wait a minute, that's square miles. So thank you.
Hi, my name is Elaine Finberry. I live at 160 Foster Street, and I'm not here to talk about coverage. I'm here to talk about land use. And the main purpose of the planning board is to provide and guide orderly growth development in our community, generally accomplished by the master plan we talked about earlier today, the implementation of the plan, zoning bylaws, planning board rules and regulations. And this process assures that the town citizens and the welfare of the town citizens and the interests of the town citizens are protected. I'm speaking here tonight to oppose the petition for the installation of the telephone cell tower on my neighbor Steve Young's property located at 122 Foster Street. The proposed location is adjacent to my property on a hill we both, Mr. and myself, both own. The current proposal calls for the installation of a tower in violation of the town's zoning ordinances with regard to use and setback, and the zoning board has not yet acted on the variances that have been requested. On the one hand, I want you to know it's really difficult for me to stand here and speak against this proposal. I've known Steve for over 30 years. We've been good neighbors. We've worked together over the years to maintain our part of North Andover as one of the last havens for agriculture and farming. So it's difficult personally to oppose him, but I'm absolutely convinced that to build a cell tower on agricultural land is wrong. But maybe even more so, my disagreement about the proposed cell tower use is because of the unique history of this particular property, the importance of the legacy of that history for this community, and the integrity of our fair application of zoning and land use rules in our town. Just for the record, I still buy my eggs every week. Steve's a farmer. On a regular basis, he raises his sheep, heifers, and cows, depending on the season, on my property, located at 160 Foster Street. Additionally, he utilizes the land I own across the street to graze heifers. The land across the street from my house is property sold to me and my husband by Earl Foster many years ago with the specific admonition not to develop the land and to do whatever was necessary to keep the land open and used for agricultural purposes. This is property that has been in agricultural use since before the North Parish was established in 1709, and all of the land, including Steve's property, was once part of the historic Foster Farm property. Foster Farm was one of the earliest in North Andover, dating from the mid-17th century, or roughly 1650. The installation of a 130-foot monopole or industrial cell tower flies in the face of this tradition of farming and threatens to destroy the purposes for which this land has been set aside. A cell tower that is proposed to look like a fake spruce tree with faux branches erected upon ancestral farmland that dates from the mid-1600s is downright disrespectful. This proposal would be a defamation to the history of Foster Farm and the authenticity of that history. It will create a horrible blight on the pristine agricultural landscape, and I believe to approve this project would be really a travesty. I urge this board to do whatever is in your power to prevent this industrial development on agricultural land. A commercial enterprise seeks your approval for a cell tower in the middle of a residential agricultural area, and this should not be allowed. Should the installation of this tower be permitted, it will desecrate a historic landscape that is currently protected within the confines of Mass General Laws, Chapter 61A. I believe at this point it's important for the planning board to also understand the historical legacy of the property in more detail. The Foster family was one of the earliest in North Andover. The family's history, in now what is the United States, dates back to Reginald Foster, who arrived on our shores after being persecuted in England for being a member of the Puritan faith. He settled in what is now Ipswich in 1638 to pursue his religious freedom. Reginald's son, Ephraim, moved west and settled in what was then known as the newly formed Andover parish. He was one of the 25 earliest settlers in Andover, and thus he became one of Essex County's earliest farmers. Ephraim died in 1685, so it is as likely he established his farm in the middle of the 1600s. For America, this is as early as it gets. I believe a plaque has been installed outside this town hall meeting room commemorating the fact that the Fosters were one of the founders of West Town of Andover. This original Foster farm, which dates back to the 17th century, was originally comprised of a huge swath of land that at one time straddled North Andover of Oxford, from what is now Foster Street to Salem and well beyond, including what is now part of Route 114 and known historically as the Berry Farm. I believe this board recently allowed property owners of that former farm to turn that property into an apartment complex. The proposed cell tower would be placed on land that abuts the Foster family homestead located at 160 Foster Street. This is my property, and it is property that my husband and I have worked very hard to maintain and restore over the more than 30 years we have lived there. The work is ongoing and will in all likelihood be a lifetime project. The original Foster homestead was owned by Mr. Nathan Foster. He was descended from Ephraim, and his homestead was built across the street at 130 Foster Street, 135 Foster Street. That homestead was moved from North Andover to Abbott Street in Andover sometime in the 1800s. In 1832, based on records reviewed at the North Andover Historical Society, the property now known as 160 Foster Street was constructed. Town records show a receipt from a carpenter whose name was Levy Farnham that, quote, from April the 23rd, 1832, with two hands, every day, 6 days a week, until June the 2nd, construction was ongoing at 160 Foster Street. The receipt is for 29 doors, 28 window frames, 168 sash to build the fine federal house. The house was designed with traditional coppers, an L, a ridge roof, stone basement, twin chimneys, and a corner porch. At one time, the property also had a horse farm and a carriage shed. Nathan Jr. had two sons, Warren, who inherited 160, and Charles, for whom he carved off 135 Foster Street. Foster Farm in time became three family farms. The one located at 135 Foster Street was known as Rocky Knoll Farm. The one located at 160, the Foster Farm, and the farm located at 193 Foster Street was known as the Briar Hill Farm. The eldest son, Archie Foster, inherited the property at 160. 135 Foster Street passed to Herbert, and 193 Foster Street went to Harry, Warren's other son. And so the property stayed in the family for almost 250 years. Herbert's son, Earl, bought the Rocky Knoll Farm from his grandmother in 1935. Earl was a very hardworking and a very determined guy. He had a sharp wit and an independent nature. In addition to an egg root, Earl was able to develop a thriving dairy herd of Ashire cattle. He was a lifelong resident of North Andover. About that same time, the Foster Farm located at 160 Foster Street was deeded out of the family for the first time since its construction in 1832. Almost 50 years later, in 1984, my husband and I bought the old house at 160 Foster Street. Earl and Beatrice arrived at our doorstep a day or two after we purchased the house to welcome us to the neighborhood and briefly tell us of the legacy of the property. They also suggested we get a cat or two as soon as possible. We knew we had accepted the stewardship responsibility that comes with owning an historic home, but what we didn't realize that we also inherited a legacy. We supported our neighbor Earl and his wife Beatrice with a solemn promise to protect the open spaces and preserve the landscape. A number of years after we purchased our home, Earl and Beatrice sold us a 2-acre parcel across the street from our house with the request that we would do whatever we could to keep the land open for agricultural purposes. In 1998, subsequent to the passing of Earl and Beatrice Foster, the town of North Andover exercised its right under the 61A agricultural classification to buy the farm. Some of the land went to a soccer field, the rest allocated to conservation and open space for trails and for haying. Our parcel, surrounded by the farm, continues to be used for grazing. The original Foster Farm sense of place is still intact. The relationship between the land and the homesteads at 160, 135, and 193 Foster Street still exists to this day. And the field beyond still tells the story of our town's agricultural history. A farmhouse and its farmland. The community bikes by it, cars drive by it, and people pause to admire its splendor, as well as the grazing animals. This is a sacred cultural landscape that tells the story of our New England past with particular emphasis on our community story. North Andover, Massachusetts, a good inland town, a town whose history was farming. And so now we must return to the present. The proposal in front of you seeks permission to build a huge 130-foot tower on 122 Foster Street, 30 feet from 160 Foster Street. The tower would be visible from the soccer fields as well as from many neighboring properties. Both 122 Foster Street and 160 Foster Street have 61A classifications. A cell tower is not an agricultural use. It is a commercial industrial use. You, the members of the planning board, are the stewards of our future as you oversee land use and planning. I submit to you that the Foster Farm is an unusually distinctive and important local resource because of the old homestead still exists within the context of an unspoiled and unchanged cultural landscape that predates the 1709 establishment of the North Carolina. The setting and the relationships between the homesteads and the landscape remain unchanged. This is very unusual today. As in most towns, you will see a historic house here and there, but in a suburban setting, not in their original context. And so I argue that it is the relationship between the two, the original farmhouses and their iconic context, that are important. Constructing a cell tower at the heart of this 17th century farm would not be consistent with what should be a town priority, to preserve this last piece of cultural landscape. The North Andover Historical Society has launched an important project to create awareness about North Andover's farming past. It is called the Farm Legacy Project, and it is an effort to keep local history alive. The project hopes to educate our residents that despite change that has come to our town, agriculture is still vital and important. Farms are still present, and the past should not be forgotten, but rather our past should be respected and protected. In a way, the town made Foster Farm a public land when it purchased the Foster Farm from Earl and Beatrice Foster's heirs. They decided the land was important, and they allowed children to play on it and citizens to walk the fields with their dogs. We continue to use it for grazing animals and haying. But now I ask you to also protect it because it is threatened by a cell tower. And in a very real way, this land is a poster child for our town's history. It is your fiduciary responsibility as planning board members to protect the Foster Farm property. It is a sacred place and should not be sacrificed because cell phone service allegedly might get a little bit better for some customers. It is my understanding that North Andover has land set aside for commercial industrial use, and it would appear that if a cell tower needs to be built, The place to erect it would be in land so designated. Also, if the tower is placed in public lands, the public would then benefit from the monthly rent and fees that would be collected. Foster Farm needs to be protected from intrusion, not because it is, only because it is historically significant and iconic, but it must be protected because this is our history, and we all bear witness to our civic responsibility to protect the story, this farmland and sites. Thank you for your consideration. I would also like to leave you with brochures on the Farm Legacy Project, an important new project that the Historical Society is undertaking. And I think the more information you know about it, the more people are going to get involved, and hopefully this becomes an important part of it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you have any questions for the applicant?
Is that a copy of your letter? Okay.
Yes. Do you have any, Zara said, any specific questions for the applicant?
Excuse me?
Do you have any specific questions for the applicant?
For the applicant, I would say to the applicant that the applicant should look for another site.
Okay.
You know,
That's an admonition, not a question, but we'll take it at that. Fair enough.
Sometimes there shouldn't be, you shouldn't feel that.
Okay.
Are there,
Got it. Yeah, go ahead.
are there any historic preservation restrictions on the property?
Not that we're aware of.
Ma'am, do you have any historic
Excuse me.
Can I just... Is there,
At the present, no, there are no historic restrictions on the property. North Andover, doesn't, you're not a local historic district, we're the local historic district.
But you don't have like a conservation restriction on, there's none on this property other than the 61A coverage? Or,
it would be.
Okay.
There's not.
Also, this property is most definitely likely to be eligible for inclusion on the National Register. And it would take me some time, but not too much time, to put together a nomination for that eligibility determination from the Mass Historic Commission. Should that be granted, the applicant would then have to be subjected to.
Yeah, no, you're correct. Yeah. Okay.
This is it, but this is not in a historic district, correct?
It's not in a historic district,
I'm just
and it
looking
doesn't
at the file.
have she's right, it's not on the National Register. So, any other questions from the audience here? Yeah, so if you can come up.
My name is Jared Allman. I live at 240 Boston, which is just down the street from the proposed site. So I'm actually going to reference a lot of the presentation about the coverage map and some of the reported coverage. So I'm not sure if I can control.
Yeah, if we could maybe
so essentially, if we go back to the topography of there's a slide in topography. So, yeah, exactly. So if you look at this map, the proposed site is in the middle. But if you look at all the existing sites, the one thing they have in common is elevation. So down on the left, bottom left corner is the old radar site off of the 114. The Chestnut site is up there also. And then up on the far up right-hand corner, up by the lake, is a Boxwood site, which is on a hill. This site is actually in the middle of almost a depression. It's surrounded by three big hills. You have the Bear Hill to the northwest. You've got the Foster Hill, where the power lines go up to the northeast, and to the southwest you have Huckleberry or Haymarket. Haymeadow. So when you look at the coverage maps, if you can go to, I think there's a coverage map with existing and one forward proposed. So you gain coverage on the Foster Street and part of Boxwood Street, but what you don't see in that map is on Boxwood Street, those two gray dots are proposed cans. So it's not reflected in the previous screen of coverage. But when those cans come on live, how much coverage are you going to gain from those two cans on Boxwood Street? And is that redundant with the tower's proposed coverage site?
Great question for them.
You can see it. They're shown on one of the prior submittals, and again, you're going to get the same short ribbon of coverage right on Boxford Street.
But to the north of Boxford Street is open fields, and to the south of it is a few neighborhoods in mostly swampland. So how much, if you're covering the road and the few neighborhoods that are off of it with those proposed CAN sites, why is the tower needed?
In terms, Martin, do you want to address it, please?
As the consultant town said, it's there for macro site coverage. It's to cover a large area in an efficient manner. Those sites along the road are capacity. They basically cover the road right there, the houses you can see immediately adjacent to it, and then down the road. Even the houses next to the road lose coverage in that third of a mile or quarter mile. As you go further away, the houses lose the coverage. Only the road has coverage. Also, one of the bigger things is that there's no long-term power backup for the nodes on the telephone poles. We run off commercial power. When commercial power goes off, as it did in the windstorm we had recently, those nodes have a battery that gets them over the bumps, maybe about 15 minutes worth of backup, and then the system goes down, and that coverage is lost. So when you're, especially in terms of public safety, they lose that coverage. They're not just calling back to the firehouse or anything. There's telemetry now, people in ambulances having their vital signs. Back to what we have today. Back. You're back to...
Okay, if one person at a time, please, because it's just a little bit easier. If you have a question, come up to the mic.
The additional coverage in that area is lost if the power goes off. It's there for capacity. There is no way to feed it because you can't borrow on the power system.
So another issue with the siting is, if you look at this map, Winter Street and Haymarket, Haymeadow, sorry, still don't get any coverage. It's because you put it in front of that hill on Foster Street where the power lines go up. So you put in the site, which you really, I think that you have the density coverage, 240 homes. And that's not even counting the two Boxford CAN sites that are not online yet. And there's another one that's on that map there on Salem Street, which is not online yet. So you're putting this big monopole and you're still missing a good portion, about the same amount of homes off of Winter Street all the way up to Dale Street, because that hill blocks the signal on the other side. On Bear Hill, again, your coverage is on Great Pond and Dale Street is based off of the CANs, because Bear Hill blocks the signal from that tower because you've put it down low in a valley. I mean, I don't understand why you would put this big antenna pole to cover 200 homes and you're still missing big chunks of the neighborhood. Further down the street on Foster Street, the Wintergreen neighborhood and the Lost Pond neighborhood, you have the proposed, not proposed, but it's actually planned tower in Boxford, which looks like it's going to get covered from that tower anyways. So if you have coverage from the east on a planned tower, not a proposed tower, you don't have coverage on Winter Street because you're behind a hill, and then you have a couple of CANs on Boxford Street, which is a fairly low density populated neighborhood, which are not online yet. How much coverage are you actually adding with this pole, and is it worth it to cover a few, 240 some homes that you said on your map within a 2,000 square foot radius? The alternative, it seems to me the alternative is that we should approach it much like some other municipalities have done recently, such as Andover and Wellesley and Lynn and Peabody, is building, not relying on Verizon-built local CAN systems, but instituting a direct antenna system, which is a public-private partnership where the town has an ownership stake and they lease back the capacity to the carriers. Unfortunately, their competitor, American Towers, designs DAS systems all the time. If you look up the Wellesley Town Center, the Wellesley Town site, there's an RFP that's actively going about putting up smaller pole-topping antenna systems throughout the whole town, which will increase coverage, and they can lease it back to the carriers and have an income stream from that proposal. I think it's a much, the town does have to have a high high-tech, high broadband plan. And obviously, every time you want to put up one of these big monopoles, you're going to have some opposition to it. You know, I think Wellesley had almost no input from the public about the telephone toppers. They're less intrusive, they seem to cover the gaps, and they're a revenue stream for the town. Maybe something worth looking into.
Okay, thank you.
So do you guys design DAS systems?
Yes.
Do you have any in the area? Or have you installed any locally?
Not locally, but Varsity owns and operates a number of different types of facilities, including macro sites and distributed antenna systems.
But thank you, because I think you brought a little bit of context, and you stayed exactly on point to where our focus is, so thank you. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
I'll be brief because I got out of a sick bed to come here, so I'm working with only one cylinder. So I apologize for my abilities, perhaps not to speak and articulate as well as I would normally. My name is Tom Baird. I live in 75 Foster Street. That's the second house on the right. My wife and I bought that house almost 50 years ago. We're into our 49th year there. When we moved in, we became close friends with Earl and Beatrice Foster. So we know the history, we know the beauty of the area, and in all the time, all the changes we've seen in almost 50 years, it's been absolutely enormous. All the homes, all these people building beautiful homes off Foster Street. Never once did my wife and I ever say, oh, this has ruined Foster Street. The history is no longer there. The scenery is no longer there. In fact, Foster Street has become a magnet for bicyclists and motorcyclists, joggers. So we've seen an enormous amount of change. But the location, not the fact that when I'm not opposed to a cell phone tower, but the location is wrong. And some of the words I wrote down to myself about how I feel about it personally is horrible, appalling, shocking, hideous, terrible. That's how I feel about what I'm going to see, because out of my front window, I get an unobstructed view of Bear Hill, the south side of Bear Hill. It's spectacular. Every morning I get up with a cup of coffee, I look out there. Every night I look out at the sunset over Bear Hill. And this monstrosity is going to be right there on the right-hand side of my picture window. I mention all of that because, well, by the way, Earl and Beatrice would turn over in their grave if they knew this was happening. I mention all that because I'm a retired real estate agent with Keller Williams. I sold property on Foster Street. I own property on Foster Street. And I'm telling you, without question, everybody's properties in the area are going to be affected. In my case, I'm imagining probably somewhere between $25,000 and $50,000 drop. Because when you come around that blind corner, I'm losing my voice. When you come around that blind corner, the road straightens out, goes right past my house, and it points right where the proposed tower is going. You come from the other direction, from the Winter Street direction, the same thing happens. You get a line of sight straight to the tower because the road actually curves around that parcel of land. So it's a direct line of sight. One of the things that nobody's talked about, well, let me stick to property values. It is impossible for a real estate agent to run a statistical analysis, I used to do it, on what the effect would be of a cell tower on a neighborhood. Real estate doesn't work that way. I don't want to go into a real estate lesson, but the buyer and seller coming together and agreeing on a price. And Lisa mentioned that we had our first instance this past week where there were two willing, able, and ready buyers who walked away when they learned about the cell tower. It means that the only thing the the seller can do now is lower the price until they finally get somebody that's interested. So it's going to have a major impact. And by the way, in my house, I worked on it. I probably put too much into it, but I worked on it every week for almost 50 years, inside and out. Most of what I've done is hidden, but that is my wife and my retirement, because we know we're going to eventually have to sell, and we're going to have to downsize, and we might even go into assisted living, because my parents did. So that's the money that I'm going to use, and I'm really upset that I'm going to be losing that for no fault of my own. The one other thing that I want to mention, well, a couple of things. One is the balloon pictures are all invalid. They're no good until the leaves drop. You've got another few weeks before all the leaves drop. I think when you look down Foster Street, you're going to see the base of the tower, because all the leaves will be off the trees. So, and the other thing that's going to make the view really bad is in the application on page 292, it says lighting requirements are currently unknown and will be determined by the FAA, and if needed, lighting will be a dual medium intensity red/white strobes. Can you just picture coming around that blind corner and seeing that? I mean, it would be wonderful in Christmas time, but for the rest of the year, it's going to be a god-awful eyesore, and it's going to affect property values. Just looking on page 397 with the access road for the construction, there's no way that our fire engines can get up there in case there's a fire. The way it hooks, I can't imagine a fire engine getting up there. Also, the application doesn't at all address noise. And the typical noise level, we were already told when I went with the zoning board, I was there when they inspected the site, and they were told that it would be 58 decibels. And I pulled up different cell towers online where they have video of the sounds, and they're loud and they're obnoxious. And so nothing has been done to address that. There's some other issues, but they're relatively speaking minor. I'm not going to worry about the fact that the 16 migratory birds, including eagles, that could be affected by the tower. That's per the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. But the most important thing is the fact it's going to spoil the neighborhood, and it's going to affect property prices, for sure. Thank you. And
thank you.
By the way, let me just read the first paragraph, because I don't know if everybody has read the bylaws, but I think the paragraph's important, because I think it was Peter last time you mentioned that the bylaws are how you're going to make the decision. The bylaws say that at the very beginning, section 8.9, wireless service facilities, it says, it is the express purpose of this bylaw to minimize the visual and environmental impacts, as well as any potential deleterious impact on real estate property value. And it says the general bylaws are designed to encourage appropriate land use and to preserve the rural character of the area. So that's what you're going to be making your decision on. And by the way, one thing that's really bothering me is this 300-foot setback that we see. That's fine if you're dealing with a construction of a house or a barn or a shed or something of that nature, but not something like this that sticks up high, because the people who are affected are beyond that 300-foot range. So, not looking again to say no to a cell phone tower, but a better location. Thank you.
Thank you.
Richard Stanley, Bridges Lane. I just have a question for the gentleman here, the attorney, as well as I think you say you do construction of towers, sir. My question is, if you could go to that slide about the real estate, please, for one moment. I'd like to know if the real estate consultants of New England are in fact under any type of contract with either Verizon, any of its subsidiaries, or you, sir, in the construction business. Do you know these people? Have you done work with them in the past? What is the relationship that you people have with them?
Well, they're no different than any other.
Oh, I'd love to hear his answer, sir.
No.
I love when attorneys stop being.
No, it's procedure. It's procedure because he will let you continue to go, or the chairman will ask me to answer the question. Thank you.
We'll go right ahead.
Thank you. So I was stated in New England, real estate consultants of New England obviously didn't do it for free. Varsity paid for the report. The report, as all reports, and there's the statement in the report that it says there was no predetermined outcome. Varsity didn't pay for a report that demonstrated no impact. It paid for a report to see whether or not there would be an impact, and the report concludes there is not. Has Varsity used real estate consultants in New England before? Yes. But that doesn't mean that their studies are invalid. They are professionals. They have certified that this report is done independently. If you have questions about that, we do have Mark Carenti here.
Sure, I mean, the disclosure is important, and I think you made a fair disclosure, and then we can interpret it as we choose to. Yeah.
And Mr. Chairman, through you, could I request as a resident of town and a taxpayer who is up to date on my taxes anyway, if in fact we could get your friends at New England Real Estate Consultants to provide all the backup documents so this board can look at it to see if in fact it is just a small thumbnail sketch of somebody's opinion, or if they backed it up on something that this board of volunteers, unpaid, would look at and be able to view to see if it makes sense to them.
Mr. Chairman, you have the entire report.
We have the copy of the whole report. Yeah.
Yeah, I've only excerpted because it would be impractical to show a 40-page report.
So we have it. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
And that's a public document. It's on the Google site.
It is part of supplement number 2.
Hey guys, Justin, 193 Foster Street, Owens, Justin Owens. I feel that some of the arguments about the telephone toppers is kind of disingenuous. He'd mentioned that, houses off the street wouldn't get service, but streets go near almost all of the houses in the neighborhoods, and they all have the telephone poles. And talking about the power, our cell phones also run on power, and if we have an unexpected power outage, they may not be charged. This gentleman here just plugged his phone in around the corner, so it just shows that if our phones lose power, then it doesn't matter if the cells have lost power as well. So it's kind of like a disingenuous argument to say that that really affects how they're used. And correct me if I'm wrong, is it like a relay? Relays from nearby towers?
It's on fiber, on the poles.
On the poles. So
Back to a main control center.
back to the main control. So okay, never mind then. That's fine. That's all.
It's the same route power takes.
The same route power. Right. So I was wondering if it was like from pole to pole, or is it's a data center that it's coming from?
It's fiber back to a base station controller.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Right. Good. So how much capacity on average do those have?
Not nearly as much as a macro site. They don't handle as many frequencies. We have...
Have you guys done a study of how much capacity our neighborhood needs?
I don't have access to Verizon's studies in that. That's among the most proprietary information Verizon has. As in any business, is how much business they're doing. And with them,
It just seems like that would behoove the board to say, like, if we need this capacity, then where's the demonstration of that, or the demonstrable evidence, right, is the word. Okay.
Okay. Got it. No, we understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I find it because of the bad quality wireless.
First of all, Mark Johnston, 440 Foster. I want to thank everybody here because I know there's a lot of work involved, and on a volunteer basis, I got to tell you, I appreciate it. I took a couple notes during the presentation. So I do have a question. folks here indicated that they had never gotten to an appraisal on a 61A, and I'm wondering why. No, I'm asking the folks here. Why have you not gotten to an appraisal?
Mr. Chair, do you want me to answer?
I mean, I think to some degree what the applicant said is they either have two ways to do the 61A, is to take it out of 61A and do it at the beginning or to wait at the end. And I mean, that does make intuitive sense. What would happen is that if, let's say, they went along this path, they have to make the offer to the town. If the town turned around and said, well, we might want to consider that offer and exercise the right of first refusal, that's when that process would occur. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if I can just clarify that the projects that I've been involved with, we have made the required offer, and the town has never exercised that right. So that second step of getting to the appraisal has never been necessary. That's why we haven't done it.
The town has a right of first refusal for this property as well, don't they?
Well, the
On the
right of first
conservation
refusal
basis.
under 61A is,
Yes.
that's right. The right of first goes to the town, or the town can designate and basically send that option to a third party, like trustees of the reservation, Essex County, Greenbelt, or somebody like that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, we have conservation land all over that
That's
area.
correct.
And when we looked at the locations that were originally proposed out of the 20, there were really 5 that were real in my mind, because most of them were wetlands or something else.
Yeah.
So not sure that that was a good representation of true due diligence on my part. Just to touch base on the real estate side, the evaluation of homes around cell towers. You know, all you got to do is go to websites nowadays, right? So like Truly and others actually have all this information there. And there's a reason they have it there, right? They wouldn't put it on their website if it wasn't saleable. And the bottom line is they are selling prescriptions, so you can access that information. Nobody's going to publish that on a website if it's not making money. So for us to hear that our real estate is not going to be affected is not the case in my mind. There's a reason why people publish this on the website, and we've heard a couple of examples today. So that's just another point I wanted to make. And then the last thing I wanted to say, well, a couple things. What is the intended population for this tower? You know, when you look at what has been defined, our population is not that dense, if you will, in the surrounding area that they are projecting as no coverage. I have never had a problem with coverage at 440 Foster Street or driving down that road. I'm on the phone all the time. Last thing I really wanted to bring up, are we allowed to talk about ecological effects?
If it's health, no.
Not health. However, there are other issues
Ecological, fair enough.
So,
but yeah.
There's a place called Mosquito Brook. I think we're all familiar with it, and it's called that for a reason, right? So we have there's plenty of articles that have been published in scientific journals that show that bats, birds, other wildlife are affected by this, right? We have a natural habitat to deal with mosquitoes. I'm not interested in watching that go away. I know what the effects are. I work in this business. I understand it very well. And the bottom line is we have a natural habitat here. We raise honey. We've got farms. Not interested in seeing that ruined. This is the reason why I moved here. I was the corporate sustainability director for an organization. To see where this is being thrown at, and frankly, I don't think it was very transparent at the beginning. We heard somebody at the last board meeting that indicated they hadn't received certified letter, and they were within the 300-foot.
Yeah, but at this point, we are where we are. So
Understood. I'll bring that up with the zoning board,
Yeah.
because we're setting that precedent if we don't follow our process, right? Yeah. So that's the only thing I wanted to add. Appreciate what everybody here does. Thank you.
Personally, I'd love to hear more of people from the neighborhood come up here and ask questions. I know at the meeting 3 weeks or so ago, I think there was great disappointment that Varsity Wireless and Council were not here to ask questions. And this is a great opportunity for you to. They're here now. They're here today. Ask away. I feel like they're being talked around or at and not ask genuine questions. And I encourage everybody to do that, because that's how we're going to get really good information in order to move this process forward.
I do have a few questions.
Fantastic.
I'm Pam Rivet. I live at 67 Foster Street. I will start not with the question, but this statement up here about the real estate values and the excerpts from that report leave me speechless practically, because it's stating that there's no impact for homes greater than 1,000 feet. Well, my home is less than 1,000 feet from this tower. So I find it offensive that you put this up here. One of my questions, I've written a letter to each of you, and my first question was about the NEPA assessment and public notice for comment on impacts to the environment and historic resources. Since I wrote the letter, I read through the 500-page application, and I did find within that 500-page application a large section of documents from 2014. And included in that was a notice that I was actually looking for before that, so I did find it, but it was back in 2014. So my question is, does a new NEPA notice need to be sent out as part of this, I think, new process? And what was that process in 2014, and how does that relate to this one?
Okay. Two things. Well, I will address the NEPA one, but I want to clear up one thing. So the second part of that, the second bullet I have there says, for this report, the primary research focuses on home sales within 1,000 feet or closer. So that is those are the data points that they were utilizing. So it is not data points generally over 1,000 feet. It was data points within 1,000 feet. So that is in fact being addressed by the report. It's actually the primary focus of the report, is those homes within 1,000 feet.
No impact for homes greater than 1,000 feet.
Right, and so their data, so that's why the second sentence says, because they've generally found over 1,000 feet doesn't have a concern or an influence, their focus in terms of the comparison and the evaluation they did focused on homes within 1,000 feet. So they kind of said, well, we're looking at homes within 1,000 feet, we're still not finding an impact, we're not going to go beyond that to beyond 1,000 feet. So they did focus on within 1,000.
I'll read the report. Thank you for the clarification.
So as far as NEPA goes, NEPA is a long process. Sometimes it starts, as it did in this case, well before the actual application is filed. It is all part of the same ongoing application. This wasn't a tower being proposed somewhere else. So the NEPA process was started in 2014. It is continuing and ongoing. It is still valid. It does not need to be restarted. I think that answers the question.
When will it conclude?
It'll conclude after permitting, only because any changes that come about through permitting generally just require an update or an amendment. Then you finalize it when you have your final design. So even dropping the tower hay thing triggers at least a re-notification to the entities. But it involves. We've heard things about ecological impacts. It involves notice to U.S. wildlife, it involves checking U.S. wildlife and habitats for endangered species or protected species in areas. Involves obviously notification to local Native American tribes, State Historic Preservation Office, other things like that.
As part of the documentation, it states there's a report from EBI Consulting, I think, and it states, in light of available, this was back from 2014, in light of available information, specifically the favorable environmental context and profile of a nearby previously recorded site, it is my professional opinion that the APEDE for the present project is highly sensitive for the presence of prehistoric archaeological resources. Accordingly, I recommend further archaeological work in the form of shovel test pits or other appropriate archaeological survey. Was that work completed?
No, it's destructive. It was not destructive. It is invasive, and it is something we will need to complete. But it's something that does not make sense to do in the context of an application that hasn't been approved. And that is typical. That there are things that are part of NEPA that would wait until after approval.
One point is are there any specifications in the application of how exactly the monopine will be constructed in terms of detailed specifications for size and quantity of branches?
Not in the current application. That would be as part of, that'd be submitted really to the building inspector as part of the tower foundation, final tower and foundation design.
I would like to request that the board would ask for very detailed specifications before approval so that there aren't any surprises later, because as people have probably seen monopines, along highways and what have you, that look very different than the renditions that we've seen. The renditions that we've seen clearly cover all the antennas in the pole, but the specifications, the building...
Well, I mean, I think I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think there's sort of two parts to that. There's one, it's what it looks like visually, so what you see is what you get, and I agree that's the important part. There's the other part that's obviously the structural part, that you want to have something that stands up and...
I am more important about what you see, what you get.
We deal with both of those, and that's normally part of what we would do. Yeah.
Great, thank you. There's nothing in the documentation about the minimum height analysis for AT&T. You talked about AT&T, but the only documentation is about Verizon, so I'm still not convinced that a 115-foot tower is necessary. All the analysis, all the documentation, everything that's before you is all about the 97 feet. So it doesn't seem that there's no basis for granting something higher at that. And for me, I know it's all about the cost. The carrier and the tower company can build anything. As Jared talked about earlier, in terms of different types of the pole toppers, the DAS systems, the distributed antenna systems, money can do anything. On places like Nantucket, they don't put up towers. Places like Grosse Pointe in Michigan, they don't put up towers. Wellesley, they don't put up towers. And they, as long as you have the power to stick with the bylaws and not grant all these variances and make this go, and that will push the technology to get less expensive to actually build these other types of alternatives. And that's the only way it's going to get pushed. And my last point is that if Verizon is struggling to provide coverage, I personally, not very far from the tower, I'm probably about 700 feet from the tower. We got great coverage in the house, got 4 bars standing on the site. And also, if you look at the Verizon marketing material, they advertise on their website that they get completely full coverage across North Andover and Boxford. So it just doesn't make sense to me that we should be putting up this big monstrous tower that every person is going to see, that everybody that bikes by there, everybody jogs there, everybody drives there, is going to see this big monstrosity. I don't notice the towers that are in the town. So there were towers that were compared here. It's very interesting. I don't even know where they are because they're not obtrusive. They're tucked away. They're just in a place where you just don't notice them. And I travel those streets those comparing towers. This would not be the case. Never mind that I live right there and I'm going to see it right out my window. It's everybody that goes there is going to see the tower. Thank you.
Thank you.
There was a question in there to reiterate regarding the last speaker. I can't remember your name, but she had asked why she didn't understand the AT&T height versus Verizon, and I think from earlier what you said is both carriers minimum is 97, but they can't co-locate at the same elevation. They don't stack.
Correct.
Is that fair to say?
Correct.
Okay. Because she did ask that. Just want to make sure you got an answer.
My question was more the documentation and the height analysis was only about Verizon.
That actually is, yes, that registered. Thank you. Yeah.
I won't be up here too long. Mike Fox with Bridges Lane. I guess I was just wondering how you guys figured out the coverage map. I'm specifically talking about Bridges Lane and Vest, because I'll echo what other people have said. We've got really good coverage.
We've provided, and this is a national extension, but still, we've provided the coverage plots. Part of some of the coverage plots is actually the drive test data from Verizon's network demonstrating, real world scientific testing in terms of where their coverage is. As we've talked about, the white areas are not necessarily the 100% absence of coverage. It just means it's not reliable, and it means that sometimes someone may be able to make a phone call if the network gets busier. They may not be able to make it, or may not be able to reach the internet. They may be able to make the phone call near a window, but not carry it if they, move across the room to another window or another part of the home. I get it. We get it all the time. The two things I hear a lot are, one, I have 5 bars. I don't understand why X carrier needs coverage. The scientific data is what needs to be relied on. That's what Verizon's relying on. It's what AT&T is relying on. It's what the carriers rely on in terms of overall network design. Sometimes phones may function. First of all, it depends on which carrier you have, and it also depends on other parts of where you are located in reference to the overall gap. The other thing we heard, and we heard just now from the prior person, had to do with the marketing material. Again, there's actually a case on it that says that marketing material is not reliable. It is not. It is what it is there. Well, it is because there is a difference in the engineering maps that are utilized and the way these are presented versus the way marketing materials for web loading and everything else are presented. The bin, they call the display sizes are different, and the way they don't have the same kind of granularity, and so they display different. They are smooth. You see how you get kind of all these ridges and these ups and downs and these very distinct kind of lines on this engineering map. The way typically the websites work is a lot of that gets, because of the display size, gets blended together because it doesn't have the same level of granularity that the radio frequency engineers provide in an engineering map. Radio frequency engineers do not rely on whether it's called personal coverage check or the website, sales maps. Those are not engineering tools. This is an engineering tool. The drive test is an engineering tool.
I would presume that, if you take Vestway and Bridges Lane, that both Verizon and AT&T probably know the rough number of subscribers on those streets, right?
They probably have that data, yes.
Yeah. I mean, is that how they do it?
No.
Is that how they back into some of this information?
No. As a matter of fact, so no, typically, the carriers, certainly, obviously, number of subscribers in an area can be a factor. If they're having, if KPIs are showing that they're having issues, that would be a factor. But in terms of coverage and areas, the carriers are looking at overall, or at least the cases are looking at overall number of population, because that is the potential subscriber base, right? Everyone is a potential subscriber, and people have argued, and municipalities have argued, well, X carrier only has 5%, and maybe it's a regional carrier, only has 5% market penetration. So really, their gap is only 5% of that population. But that's not true. And the cases have said, no, what you need to look at in that instance is the overall population, because they are potential subscribers and users, and of course, if they don't have coverage in that area, then they wouldn't necessarily be a subscriber, but if you put coverage there, they would be. The other part about that is just the overall goal of the Telecommunications Act, which is to promote competition, promote deployment, promote advancement of technologies. And if you only look at market share per carrier when you're looking at a gap, you're not going to get that. Because you're going to say, well, we have Verizon, that's enough, we don't need anyone else. And the cases have clearly demonstrated that that's the type of analysis that you cannot make. Each gap is evaluated on the basis of the individual carrier.
I guess I would ask if maybe the board get a chance to go and drive around or walk around Bridges and Vest, try out your own cell phones.
Okay, good. Anybody else? I'd like to kind of finish it off in a few minutes because we have been at it a long time, but I don't want to cut anybody with a burning desire to talk, so.
Thank you very much. Jerry Margolis, 46 Foster Street. We're 3 houses away from this proposed site, and I do want to tell you this is well past my bedtime. So, but this is a very important matter. Now, I understand there's a noise emitted from the tower. Is that correct? Can someone answer that question?
The tower does not emit noise. There is a generator. There are HVAC units that will emit some. There's a generator that will emit some. And we have submitted that noise study. Actually, I think the very first hearing we had a lot of discussion about the noise.
Okay. Well, my question is it a constant drone that you're hearing? Is it intermittent? Does it go on and off? Does it go on every half hour, every hour? How does that work?
Good question. So the generator is unless it's on for emergency purposes, and even then, in the first instance of a power outage, the facilities do have battery backup. So the first several hours, the battery backups would kick on. The generator wouldn't even kick in to provide backup power. In the event of a non-emergency, as we talked about once a week, the generator will cycle for 45 minutes to an hour. As we talked about, that can be set so it runs at an appropriate time. It doesn't kick on at 4 o'clock in the morning. So it could run at a time that's appropriate. Even the generator, as shown in the noise report, complies with requirements in terms of noise at the property line. In terms of the HVAC units, those kick on and off, much like every other HVAC unit. So it has a thermostat. If it's too hot, it runs. When it cools down to the temperature it needs to be at, it kicks back off. But those will be far lower and will not, again, not exceed the requirements of the property.
Okay. Well, it sounds like perhaps Lanny and your husband are probably going to hear this the most. I would imagine, because you'd be right next to it.
But we do have the information of how many decibels and everything it is, so you're welcome to look at that, and we'll go back and look at it again ourselves.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was just wondering if there's going to be a constant drone 24 hours a day, but counselor's telling me that it's going to go on as needed. So thank you.
Julie Ross, 104 Bridges Lane. I have one comment and a question. My comment is that I live about 5 houses away from Mike, and we have terrible cell phone coverage. So there are times when I have 0 bars. I have to walk to one of my windows to get service. I have missed texts from my kids. Both my husband and I work from home. We try to use our house phone as much as possible for work, but sometimes we can't. So for us, it's an issue. But then I do have a question about the acreage. So I think I heard that Mr. Young has 10 acres of the 61A designated, is that right, land?
I think he said all but 1 acre of the property.
Okay.
And I didn't say that.
I believe it's 10.5.
Okay, and of the 10.5, will all of them be sacrificed and no longer be used for agriculture because of the building of the tower?
No. It would only be the area associated with the tower, so the leased area and the access road.
So
the rest of it would remain 61A. You don't have to pull the entire property out of 61A.
So your understanding is some of it will still be used for agriculture if he wanted it to be?
The vast majority will still be within 61A use. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, any last comments? Okay, well, thank you all. We appreciate it. I do, before we go, want to bring up, Pete, do you have a question first?
Maybe quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
So on your real estate, could you bring that up again? So my read of this report, I'm just asking if it's correct. None of the analysis in this report is comparing the value of a house near an antenna before the antenna was built compared to after the antenna. My read of this report is that, if I've got it right, it's actually all based on comps. So if you have a 4,000 square foot home near an antenna, an existing antenna, the sale price of that home is being compared to 10 or 20 or 30 similar 4,000 square foot homes elsewhere. It's just a basic comp analysis, and I don't think I saw anything in there comparing the value of a house before an antenna went up compared to after the antenna went up. Is that about right?
I'm just going to let Mark Carente,
Yeah, if
who
you
did the
come up
report.
to the,
Thank you. Mark Carenti, real estate appraiser, Commonwealth, Massachusetts, and state of New Hampshire, for about 20 years, and also a real estate broker for a little bit over 10 years. I want to understand your question and answer it. You are looking for a situation where the cell tower existed first, or are you looking for a situation where the house existed?
I'm actually trying to understand what this report used as a methodology.
Absolutely.
Did this report compare any home values of a single home before a nearby tower was built and then again after the tower was built?
After the tower was built. Before the tower was built and then after.
So you have a home.
You would need to sell twice, and the answer would be no.
So none of that before-after methodology is in this report?
No.
Okay.
No.
I just want to make sure I understand the methodology.
Could I ask a quick question about the report?
yes, very quickly.
Yeah. Does it
Come up to the mic, please.
Thank you.
He doesn't have to go. Does it compare other homes in agricultural type areas, or is it homes like the Chestnut Street or Johnston Street, which are much more compact neighborhoods?
Those were the sales that we were able to find. In order for the match pair analysis to happen, you have to have a sale, and preferably it would be within 1,000 feet. We have some examples where it's less than 300.
And then I only have one more. Okay, go ahead. Is there a short answer to whether or not there's been any analysis of relocating the tower to a different spot within this parcel? In terms of what difference would that make on impact of the tower on all the concerns we've heard tonight?
We've not looked at, actually, Steve, have you looked at moving it? I mean, in terms of doing like some sort of visual demonstration, no. I think in terms of, kind of looking at, again, one, minimizing a lot of the impact, on the property in terms of clearing and length of access road and things like that, and putting it back closer to wetlands. One of the things we noted in the discussions is, the middle part of the property is a deep depression, and so the height of the tower would go up considerably, and then when you're talking about things like 2 times tower height and things like that, or 3 times tower height, those numbers would change, and so based on trying to minimize the overall impact and locate it in a way that was most appropriate, we thought this was the best spot.
Okay, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to talk about, before we move on, a logistics issue, and it gets at the timing. And we have a 150-day clock on this. We're how far into it, Gene, are we?
Filed on August 16th.
She said January.
So we still have some time, but we don't have an enormous amount of time. And it's as you heard tonight, a very strong preference not to make our decision until the ZBA decides, because they're the threshold where they have to approve a variance. That's our preference. If we run up against that limit and you need to give us an extension, I presume you would.
We're in November, and we're out in January. At this point, I say this. Generally, Varsity and myself, even representing the clients, very cooperative when it comes to the shot clock deadline. We need to see where we are when we get there, because right now we have a lot of time. I think the ZBA will act far in advance of that.
Again, you need to start thinking about that, because if you box us into a corner, we only have one decision to make, because unless the variances are approved, we can't approve it. So,
no, understood. And the ZBA is on a slightly different timeline. They have a little bit longer. It's about 30 days or so, slightly longer. Let's just say this. I wouldn't say no, as long as we are cooperating and we understand where we are in the timeline and it makes sense, and it's not just kind of for the sake of dragging it out. And look, I've been before this board a number of times. That's not your style. If an extension is appropriate, you'll get it. If not, I can't say we would grant it in every circumstance, but usually.
But you are aware and you understand our position, and we will continue to put this on the table. So I feel like we should schedule this again in 2 weeks but I don't think we need to go through anywhere close to, obviously. This was effectively the initial one because this is the first hearing where a lot of abutters came. Yeah. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that. I'd like to just put it on the agenda, but, we don't necessarily, we can't afford to spend this much time.
Here's my thought. I would, based on the discussion tonight, be very interested in hearing more back from the applicant on the specific point about distributed antenna systems.
Yeah.
That's a little different question than my poor terminology of, the antenna on top of the pole. It's the distributed antenna systems that we heard a very good description and analysis of. I would really be interested in hearing back from the applicant on that.
It'll be similar to...
We'll answer the question. Mr.
One of the other points that the gentleman raised.
Clarify specifically what? Yes.
I think actually, just a little bit more in terms of what you're looking for, whether or not it will work. What are you trying to figure out?
It sounded like it was successfully used in other communities within the region. And so my question is not a binary, distributed antennas or the pole. My question is either distributed antennas or the pole or a hybrid of the two. We've had a lot of discussion about the height, and to the latter part here, the hybrid, what would an analysis show of a partial further reduction in height where the loss of coverage could be compensated for with a partial distributed antenna system? I don't know what the answer is to that.
Mr. Chairman,
Instead of the 21st, if we could go to your first meeting in December, I will not be here on the 21st.
Okay. That's fine.
And candidly, in terms of what Mr. Boynton's looking for, and by getting it the Thursday before the 21st, I don't think time-wise that'll happen.
Yeah. So. I mean, I think from my perspective, the gentleman sitting right behind you asked a lot of very good questions, and those are the ones you should focus on. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That, if you want to go back and reread the thing, listen to every single question he asked, because I think every question he asked was a good question.
Got a lot of notes.
Yeah.
So thank you. So what is your first meeting in December?
December 5th.
And 7 p.m., right?
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all for your kind patience and consideration.
I want to say for the finale, I guess.
I guess not. Yeah, I mean, I hate to let it drone on, but if people don't feel they have to, like when we were this radio speech, I cut her off. But you can't.
I understand.
Yeah.
So if you appreciate
Yes.
his volunteers.
Yes, thank you.
We're on overtime now, so the sky's the limit.
We're making tons of money now. Okay. Well, if you want to go, I'm sorry for keeping you here. Yeah. I know. Yeah. Okay. We have a little more business here, so if everybody could. Oh yeah, use my gavel here. Yeah. I feel very powerful tonight. Okay, Jean.
Future reference, when that back is happening, move the mics closer to you, and then she can turn the mics down. So in case I forget in the future.
Bring them closer?
Bring them closer, and then she can turn the mics down.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
If you're farther away, we have to crank the mic, and that's when it starts to pick up.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, that's fine. I know. Okay. Oh, jeez, these guys.
Dan, did you go to the Did you bring us coffee?
Okay, we are on to the 1679 Osgood Street public hearing. So we can finish this up quickly, I hope.
The applicant's before you for site plan review for a special permit within the CBV 3 zoning district to allow for a contractor's yard and outside storage of landscape products and landscape equipment. They've made some minor adjustments to the site plan based on last meeting's discussion. So to the rear of the property, additional screening has been placed, and it's actually in a staggered format so that, again, the intent is to screen from the subdivision behind. The pavement that the building commissioner asked to be included in the parking areas has been included. And the fire department, I asked to revisit the site just to make sure they understood those 9 parking spaces to the rear of the 2 kind of structures right in the middle of the lot. And so they did a test where they put in a vehicle both in the first spot and the last spot, and they've confirmed they have access throughout the property. The DPW has confirmed they visited and they've reviewed the additional pavement being added. They're okay with the site, and the Board of Health has confirmed they're okay as long as the site is conditioned that no additional flow to the septic system will be through the residences. So they would like a portable toilet on site and conditioned that if a business is to go here, they had to use that format. Okay. So that has been put into a draft decision, which is before you tonight for review, if you so choose to.
Any questions from the board?
Were you able to talk with the neighbors after
I
the
did.
meeting?
We spoke out there that night. Actually, one was here tonight, and then when you started that other conversation, he has to go to work tomorrow. So.
And I did inform him of the changes to the site plan. So he just wanted to know if the decision had been made. I explained it had not been made, but that the draft decision was prepared and he could review that in the agenda packet. So.
Did you provide any thoughts?
The bushes, the way we did it, that was after I discussed it with him, where we put it and talked about it, and that's what we both decided would be work for him and me, both because of his view from where his house is.
Any other questions from the board? Yeah. I mean, that was the one question I had, and I guess he could have stayed if he wanted to, if he was mad at you. So, yeah. So, thank you for working.
He sat next to me at that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you for working with him. It's always good to be good neighbors and work that stuff out. So, if there are no other questions, would somebody like to make a motion to close the public hearing?
I'd make a motion to close the public hearing as to 1679 Osgood Street, Lawlor, application for a site plan review special permit.
Okay. Second. Motion made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Good. Let's go through and read the decision.
So the hours of operation, Monday through Saturday, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. with the exception of snow plowing. That works?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, very good. I think that's an important condition to have in there, as long as it works, and I think that's helpful for the neighbors. So.
No. There's one in the packet over there if you'd like to grab it, but...
Gene, could you add to the findings of fact what we just talked about, that they added additional screening, because I think that's an important nexus in this case.
And another thing that I thought was also an important finding of fact was that there were complaints about noise, but those were already present. It didn't seem like this was going to...
That wasn't my problem.
Right. It didn't seem like this was going to add more noise, which I thought was important, because I think my biggest concern was noise, and I do think that the screening is great for both noise and for view, but also from the testimony we heard that this particular site plan was not going to add, as far as we know, additional noise. So I thought that was an important finding of fact as well.
It was deemed an existing condition, and this
Right.
should not further...
Having to do more with other neighbors.
The bond amount is lower than post-bond amounts, but we really just need an as-built. There's no
Yeah, I think
construction to be done.
that's fine. Yeah. Okay. All good. Okay. Would somebody like to make a motion to approve with subject to the amendments tonight?
I'll make a motion to approve the site plan review special permit for 1679 Osgood Street, provided the amendments that we spoke about are added to the decision.
Second. Motion made and seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, good. Thank you.
So, thank you. Have a good night.
Yeah. Sorry we kept you so long. Yeah. Okay. Let's do, Gene, this watershed violation. What's up with that?
Okay. So there was a violation, I believe, September 9th. Let me get my notes for it. 440 Great Pond Road, for those that aren't familiar with it, it's that house on Great Pond Road that has begun and stopped construction a number of times over the last several years. Somebody has recently bought it and begun work again on, I think it was September 9th, yes. A landscaping crew violated the watershed protection bylaw by cutting down several trees right along the shoreline, so they violated also the Conservation Commission's order of conditions. They're working on a restoration plan. I thought they'd be ready for tonight, so they aren't before us, but I did include the pictures and the enforcement order in the packet. They will be coming the first meeting in December, which is December 5th. They are going before Conservation on the 29th of November. They've hired a wetland scientist to delineate and will eventually be able to demark the 100-foot line, and they're working on a restoration plan that will have to be approved by not only the Conservation Commission, but yourselves.
Yeah.
So it was a landscape crew. The owner has owned up to it. He has no problem. They've hired the right people now. The initial time coming before Conservation, they didn't have those things in place. And so they've asked for an extension in order to get the right plan done. So they will be back. dropped, but I just wanted to let you know it hasn't been dropped, and we are working on it.
So this work was done on the weekend, and it was the water treatment plant that first heard the cutting, and it's you can see in the photos it's right on the shoreline.
Okay, so 1600 Osgood and framework for recreational bylaw.
So 1600 Osgood, again, just has to be carried in the event you have any questions. And I'm going to ask you, do you want to continue carrying it? Because it doesn't seem there's more information being submitted, but it was more a preference whether you have questions for them on an ongoing basis or you're ready to drop that from the agenda item and continue on with the bylaw framework.
Well, we're doing the bylaw framework. I mean, I view it as, keep it open as an open item, just in case something comes up that we could talk about, but the applicant or the potential applicant doesn't have to come. You guys can choose to come, certainly, if they want to. But
so we'll continue to carry it.
So in terms of where we are,
okay, so we covered the Board of Health earlier today, and
Yeah.
Suzanne, you came in after that, but they offered their perspective. So since your last meeting, the Board of Selectmen have voted unanimously to ban 2 of the 5 licenses allowed by the state. Those 2 are the marijuana retailer and the craft marijuana cooperative. So Suzanne, I believe, has been directed to work with the town manager to craft a general bylaw, which, again, is separate than the zoning, and so you heard perspective on recreational today with the Board of Health, but for your reference, the Board of Selectmen unanimously voted to ban both retail and the marijuana craft cultivators.
So will that be a bylaw that will go before town meeting?
Yes.
And then would be subject to just a majority?
Just a majority, right. It'll be a general bylaw.
So I think the question I have for the board is how do we reflect, and this is a very open question, the desires and the kind of the guidance of the Board of Selectmen in saying that they think that there should be a ban on retail and this craft cultivation. In drafting our bylaw where that may or may not pass at town meeting.
So I know we had that discussion last time at this last board meeting, and so we thought about it. And one of the ways that could be done is to, in the warrant, do sort of an appendix, do an asterisk with an appendix, and then you have your one bylaw consistent, you have your one zoning bylaw consistent with the general bylaw proposed by the Board of Selectmen, which bans the retail and the craft cultivation. And then if that fails, then you have the asterisk, and then you have your sort of alternative zoning bylaw that addresses those issues, so that there would be proper notice and that we would have that framework ready to go if, in the event that it didn't pass. That's essential.
That sounds great to me. I just want there to be the option if the general bylaw passes and retail sales and the cultivator are banned, then it's easy to make the zoning bylaw accompany that. But if not, my big fear is having this hole where now we haven't zoned for it at all. So I think we just keep going with our same process that we're going for now. Imagine that it is allowed, and because to me, if the town votes down that bylaw, to me that says the town wants retail or doesn't want to ban it, and then at least we should consider zoning for it.
So I do have a question about that. I understand the concept to essentially have a plan B ready.
Right.
The question I have is, does that have the unintended consequence, could it have an unintended consequence of when residents who are not part of all the sausage making here are making a decision to vote, they see that, oh, well, the planning board actually has a provision, not in the primary, but as a backup.
Well, wouldn't the board vote approval or disapproval for the general bylaw? I mean, the planning board could vote approval for a general bylaw banning craft and retail. It could be very obvious. I mean, you all could vote and say, we support a ban on retail and craft, and yet still craft a bylaw where, in case the rest of the town doesn't agree with what we approve, at least we have that in there, which by the way, could happen,
Right,
because in the
could
last
happen.
vote, it happened.
I think, Pete, if I may say, I think your concern is that if we do that, how do we get the right message across to people? Because it may be perceived that we really do support retail. I think that's really what
my
your
question.
concern is.
Yes.
So could it have an adverse consequence? I happen, if you explain it well, I happen to agree that I don't think it would. I mean, that would be if it were explained well, I don't think people would have a problem with it, but it is a potential risk.
I mean, you get up in front of the town meeting and you express the will of the board, and you can very expressly say, the planning board voted, I mean, if that is indeed what you voted to support the Board of Selectmen's choice to ban retail and craft.
I don't think we vote on that.
Don't we have to vote up or down one way or the other? Or aren't we asked for a recommendation? Or aren't you asked for a recommendation in the warrant? Yeah.
The planning board wouldn't typically.
You could still offer it up.
But there's an explanation of the warrant, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think what would happen if somebody came up, you could see somebody came up and go, ha-ha, why are we voting this down when the planning board has this article that they proposed that allows it? Well, I think
ready to go.
Ready to go. I think what you do then is one of us gets up and says, no, we only did it as a contingency. You should vote for this.
You should state that very specifically.
Yeah.
If that is the will of the board.
Yeah.
I mean, if everyone is in agreement, you all,
Yeah.
then you would state that very clearly. And the thing is like the reason, the explanation is easy. You have to put that in there because the last town meeting, if it was a simple majority, it would have passed.
Yeah.
For, I know it's a different issue, but nevertheless, so the risk, if you want to call it a risk, the likelihood is significant that the recommendation of the Board of Selectmen to ban retail and craft could be shot down. That could easily happen. You have to be ready for that.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So in addition to the warrant article, we'll have an explanation. We also submit a planning board report that could also, again, describe the reasons for each warrant, each article.
Yeah.
I mean, I definitely understand the concern here. I think if we know that that's a concern ahead of time, I think we can definitely craft something that says this bylaw is established to zone in for Plan A and zone for Plan B. We're not, frankly, I wouldn't even take a position on this, which is better. But if warrant article X passes, then we recommend Plan A. If warrant article X doesn't pass, then we recommend Plan B. But at least we have a recommendation for a zoning bylaw, which would come after the general bylaw is voted on. I think we'd have to go in that order.
Yeah. So, okay, is there any other things that...
So in addition to that, what we've included in the packet is another draft of the bylaw incorporating comments made at the last meeting and incorporating the Board of Selectmen's votes. So you have a clean version and an edited version if you want to go through it tonight, or...
Are we going to have, for our next planning board meeting, are we going to have a cleaner agenda? Because I feel like I would like to spend a meeting to actually walk the text where we're fresh.
I think you will.
And we can devote enough time to it. And if next meeting we don't have much else on it, let's put this at the front and really march through this, because I think we have to.
The agenda.
Yeah.
Right now, I think it may be the sole item. I'm not positive on that, but so since Varsity Wireless has continued to the 5th, and we just closed out 1600 Osgood, the mills are opening up on the December 5th with the new hearing, so next meeting, as far as public hearing goes, I think it will be very clean. There might be a discussion item here or there, or a bond release, but but with that note, I will not be here at the next meeting. I'm on vacation. Suzanne will be here. Good timing. But the text, I mean,
yes.
I think it's in good form at this point.
I have 3 comments on this red line text. I don't want to get into a big discussion right now because it's late and we're going to dedicate a meeting.
But you should get them on the table.
I would like to just throw it out. Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my item 1 is We did have a couple discussions at a couple meetings about sort of requirements or design or build guidelines, and whether that's in the bylaw or in something else. And we don't want to pin it down necessarily to building within a building, but I was looking for something that was referring to current best practices. I did see a section in here that was talking about, sort of the well, there is no standard base, but controlling odor. But I didn't see enough in there on sort of a requirement for the current best practices to do that, which if it were today would probably include the building within the building. So that was item 1. Item 2 is in 814.13.2. Just waiting until town council gets to 814.13.2.
Okay, yes.
So second line, has been renewed to increase the allowed area exponentially. So the word exponentially is really problematic for me, because let's say that there was an approved facility, for the sake of discussion, for 250,000 square feet. Exponentially would mean, if it was the power of 2, would be approving 6.25 billion square feet. And I don't think that's our intent.
You're right.
Yeah. So
absolutely.
That word jumped out on me.
Okay.
And then my third and last one was 814.13.2, subparagraph 8, ventilation. So this is good because it gets to the, under 8, Roman numeral 2, no odor from marijuana processing can be detected. That's great. But my question is, and I don't have a remedy for this, I would like to ask for advice from Gene and town council, is let's say that the whole thing goes forward and it's built, and that doesn't work, and there is odor. Oda. Wow, that's a Boston accent.
Yeah.
What is the remedy in this bylaw? And it's that question, what is the remedy, that I was looking for and didn't see, and maybe I'm not asking the question exactly right,
No, I know what you're saying.
but I'd love to hear back on that.
So is there a violation of their special permit?
It would be.
Yeah.
And therefore?
And 814.19 provides the prohibition against nuisances, and it says, no use shall be allowed in the MU, which creates a nuisance to abutters and surrounding area. And it talks about explosion fumes, gas, smoke, odors.
Fumes, odors.
Obnoxious dust, vapors, noise, and vibration
I'm still wondering, what's the remedy?
So the
It would be a remedy for any material or even immaterial violation.
Meaning that operations cease?
Well, that's what you have to decide. That's what you have to decide. I mean, we ought to start with the rules under the special permit, just in general, but see if there's anything specific we can do,
So there is. So there's the process for a zoning violation, and that's processed through the building inspector issuing the notice of a potential violation, and then a potential cease and desist order, and then a filing in district court for penalties and fines. And then there is also, under the general bylaw, there is a nuisance bylaw, prohibition against nuisance. And then this could also be deemed that, and that could be enforced under the basis of a nuisance. And that is also penalties and fines, as opposed to injunctive relief. Yes.
The reason I'm raising this is that I feel we've had multiple indicators that this is an important issue, the odor. And I think in the case we have before us, the applicant has shown us, well, here's the plan, building within a building, carbon filtering, and it all sounds great. But if it doesn't work, I feel that we know enough today that it's a big deal. And that if it turns out that the remedy is, well, that's just the cost of business, we're going to continue and, sorry, we can't do anything about it. But that's not what we should be. There should be something of more consequences.
So,
Sorry,
but such as a cease and desist is what you're saying, or something, that ability of the board to put that into as a condition to a special permit, essentially.
Well, if not that, something that is of some consequence, because That's the sort of thing that I feel we've heard a lot about. And I feel that the sort of really good input we've heard, for at least some people on the board, might be a foundational basis for decisions. And so if we're going to rest decisions on what we're being told, we ought to have a way to go back and enforce that with consequences.
Okay. Well, I'll work on some language to include some kind of remedy.
Those are the three things.
Okay, so the only other items that were submitted for tonight's discussion on this topic was a letter from Dr. Michael Connolly and I guess a response to that letter by the Osgood Landing team. You have hard copies of that as well in your packet. And I think Dan Larry tried to address the memo that he had submitted at the last meeting. He's made a small revision to it, but it is a points for further discussion and consideration in commercial draft framework. So again, I've given you a hard copy of that tonight. I know we're running up against the time. I don't know if you want to, since we're going to dedicate most of next meeting, whether you want to talk about these items then.
I think the next we'll focus on this. Okay. Is there any other?
Nope. This is all those three items I gave you in hard copy as well, but they.
Yeah, no, we'll look at them.
Okay. I'll put them in the packet as well.
We're going to escape.
Okay, we have minutes. Which meeting? Do we have minutes for?
Yes, we do have minutes for the last meeting.
Which meeting do we have to approve?
October 17th.
October 17th.
Okay, would somebody like to make a motion to approve October 17th minutes?
I'll make a motion for the October 17th minutes.
Second.
All in favor? Okay, and anything else, Jane?
Nope, I do not have anything else.
Motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second. All in favor? Aye. Aye, great, okay.